I arrived at my wife's company's party. My wife's boss and lover snapped at security, escorted him out. I was disgraced in front of 300 employees. I didn't invite you. Why did you come? My wife smirked. Few seconds later, every screen flashed. Primary key missing. Her boss screamed, "Fix it now." The whole room erupted into chaos. You ever walk into a party and instantly know you weren't supposed to be there? I'm not talking about showing up to the wrong barbecue in flip-flops when everyone else is in business casual. I'm talking about that bone-deep, stomach-dropping realization that you've just stepped into a room full of people who would rather chew glass than acknowledge your existence. Yeah, that was me tonight, walking into my wife's company anniversary gala like some kind of optimistic idiot, tux freshly pressed, because apparently I thought looking good would somehow make this less humiliating, cologne whispering expensive forgiveness into the air around me, and holding a bouquet of roses that now felt less like a romantic gesture and more like an unpaid invoice I was trying to collect on. The Grandview Hotel ballroom was one of those places that screamed, "We have money and we want you to know it," with its crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls of pretension, marble floors so polished you could probably perform open-heart surgery on them, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline that made everyone inside feel like they were masters of the universe. The whole place smelled like champagne, overpriced catering, and the distinct aroma of corporate backstabbing masked with expensive perfume. I'd been to this hotel before, back when Serena and I were actually happy, back when she dragged me to these things and introduced me as my brilliant husband, instead of pretending I was some kind of restraining order waiting to happen. The moment I stepped through those massive glass doors, the room went quiet. And I don't mean the polite kind of quiet where people pause mid-conversation to see who just arrived. I mean the kind of silence that drops like a guillotine blade, where 300 pairs of eyes suddenly lock onto you like you're a disease they're all terrified of catching. The string quartet in the corner actually hit a sour note, which honestly felt appropriate. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. Even the waiters stopped moving, frozen like someone had hit pause on reality itself. And there, standing near the center of it all in a dress that probably cost more than my first car, was my wife Serena, looking at me like I was a cockroach that had somehow learned to wear a tuxedo. Her face went through about 15 emotions in 2 seconds flat: surprise, annoyance, anger, calculation, and finally settling on that ice-cold mask of indifference she'd perfected over the past 6 months. Next to her, with his hand resting just a little too comfortably on the small of her back, was Eric Langford himself, her boss, her mentor, and apparently the guy who thought my marriage vows came with an expiration date and a corporate buyout clause. Eric was one of those guys who looked like he'd been genetically engineered in a lab specifically to run tech companies into the ground while somehow getting richer in the process. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair styled within an inch of its life. A smile that had probably been focus grouped for maximum trustworthiness, and a handshake that could crush coal into diamonds while simultaneously making you feel like you owed him money. Right now, that smile was nowhere to be found. Instead, he was glaring at me like I'd just walked into his house, kicked his dog, and insulted his mother's cooking, all while tracking mud across his white carpet. "Security," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through butter, smooth and cold, and absolutely certain of its authority. "Escort him out." I almost laughed. Actually, I did laugh. A short, sharp bark of amusement that echoed inappropriately across the now silent ballroom. Because here's the thing about Eric Langford and his perfectly orchestrated corporate events. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to remove me from a room I'd paid for. 6 months ago, it was the conference room where I'd built their entire digital infrastructure. 3 months ago, it was the office I'd worked in for 2 years without a single day off. And now it was this glittering monument to success built on the foundation I'd laid, brick by digital brick, line by line of code, while everyone else was busy networking and playing office politics. 2 security guards materialized from somewhere near the walls, both of them looking like they'd been ordered from the same catalog: broad shoulders, blank expressions, earpieces that probably connected them to some command center where someone was giving them instructions on how to remove the crazy ex-husband without causing a scene. They started moving toward me with that particular walk that security guys have, purposeful but not quite running, trying to look professional while also conveying that they were absolutely prepared to drag me out by my ankles if necessary. My wife, because she was still technically my wife, even if she'd clearly moved on to her upgrade model, finally found her voice. "I didn't invite you," Serena said, her tone dripping with that particular brand of condescension she'd developed somewhere between our last anniversary and her first business trip with Eric. "Why did you come?" It was a good question, actually. Why had I come? Was it because I still loved her, despite everything? Was it because some stupid, optimistic part of my brain thought that maybe, just maybe, showing up with flowers and wearing my best tux would somehow magically fix the smoking crater where our marriage used to be? Or was it because I knew exactly what was about to happen, and I wanted a front row seat to the show? I smiled at her. Not the warm, genuine smile I used to reserve for her when she'd laugh at my jokes or fall asleep on my shoulder during bad movies, but something sharper, something with edges. "Because you used my software to organize this event," I said, keeping my voice conversational, like we were discussing the weather or what to have for dinner, not the systematic dismantling of everything we'd built together. She blinked. Just once, but it was enough. That tiny moment of uncertainty, that flicker of something that might have been memory or realization or "oh shit, I forgot about," that crossing her perfectly made-up face. Her boss didn't blink, though. Eric Langford had spent too many years in boardrooms and shareholder meetings to give anything away that easily. But I saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hand dropped from Serena's back, saw the microscopic calculation happening behind those cold, shark-like eyes. The security guards were closer now, probably debating whether to grab me immediately or wait for another signal from their boss. The entire room was watching this play out like it was the most entertaining thing that had happened at a corporate event since someone got drunk and photocopied their ass at the Christmas party. I could see phones coming out, people probably already texting their work friends about the drama unfolding, social media posts being composed in real time about the crazy husband who crashed his wife's work gala. But here's what none of them knew. What Serena had apparently forgotten in her rush to climb the corporate ladder using my back as a stepping stool. What Eric had never bothered to figure out because he was too busy thinking he was the smartest guy in every room he walked into. The system they were using to run this entire event, from the digital invitations to the automated check-in process to the presentations that were probably queued up to play on those massive screens behind the stage, all of it ran on code I'd written. Infrastructure I'd built. Architecture I designed during countless sleepless nights while Serena slept peacefully in our bed, back when she still called it our bed instead of my bed. And systems, unlike people, don't forget who their real owner is. I stood there in my pressed tux, holding my bouquet of roses like a shield, watching the security guards approach and my wife pretend not to know me and her boss try to decide whether I was a legitimate threat or just a pathetic ex-husband making a scene, and I smiled. Because in about 90 seconds, when those presentations were supposed to start, when Eric was scheduled to take the stage and talk about innovation and success and the bright future of Nexus Data Labs, every single person in this room was going to learn a very important lesson about the difference between using something and owning it. The backup, as they say, is nothing without the original. And I was definitely the original. Rewind 2 years earlier, back when I still believed in things like merit and loyalty and the idea that if you worked hard enough, people would actually appreciate what you did for them instead of stabbing you in the back with the same knife you sharpened for them. Nexus Data Labs was struggling harder than a fish out of water, gasping for air in a market that was moving faster than their outdated servers could handle. Their infrastructure was basically held together with duct tape, prayers, and the IT equivalent of crossing your fingers really hard and hoping nothing exploded during business hours. They needed something solid, something that wouldn't collapse faster than their moral compass, which I didn't realize at the time was already pretty much non-existent. So when my old college buddy Marcus, good guy, terrible judge of character, called me up and said his company was looking for someone to rebuild their entire digital backbone from scratch, I figured why not. I was freelancing anyway, living in a decent apartment in the city, spending most of my nights teaching myself new programming languages for fun because apparently I was the kind of guy who thought debugging code was a legitimate form of entertainment. I built it. From scratch. No sleep for 3 months straight. Just an unholy amount of caffeine that probably could have powered a small city, Takeout containers stacked so high they became load-bearing structures in my apartment, and the kind of stubbornness that comes from knowing you're creating something beautiful even if nobody else understands it yet. I designed a system that was elegant, efficient, and so secure it would take a team of hackers about 50 years to crack it. And that's if they knew what they were looking for. Every line of code was mine. Every security protocol, every backup system, every failsafe. I even built in redundancies for the redundancies, because I'm nothing if not thorough. That's when I met Serena. She was working in their business development department, charming clients during the day and apparently charming me during those late nights when she'd bring coffee to the server room where I was basically living like some kind of code-writing hermit. She was brilliant in that way that makes you forget to breathe for a second. Sharp as hell, quick with comebacks, ambitious enough to want more than what she had, but not so ambitious that I thought she'd sacrifice everything to get it. The holy trinity of future heartbreak, as it turned out. But hindsight is 20/20, and I was wearing beer goggles made of optimism and loneliness. We started dating about 4 months into the project. She'd laugh at my terrible programming jokes, the ones that only worked if you understood Boolean logic and had given up on having a normal social life. We'd grab dinner at this terrible Chinese place around the corner from the office that had probably failed 3 health inspections but made the best dumplings in the city. She told me about her dreams of making it big in tech, about proving everyone wrong who said she couldn't succeed without a computer science degree, about wanting to build something that mattered. And like an idiot, I believed we were building it together. I built the system. She built her reputation on my system. Funny how that works, right? Suddenly Serena was the golden girl of Nexus Data Labs, the one who revolutionized their digital infrastructure, according to the company newsletter that didn't bother to mention my name even once. She gave presentations using slides I'd helped her make, explaining concepts I'd spent hours teaching her over coffee and late-night phone calls, taking credit for innovations that came from my brain while I stayed in the background like a stage hand who never gets to take a bow. And then there was Eric Langford, the CEO who walked around the office like he'd personally invented the internet and was just waiting for everyone to thank him for it. When he realized I was the quiet genius behind their success, and by realized, I mean when the system nearly crashed one day and suddenly everyone remembered that, oh yeah, there's actually a guy who built this thing and maybe we should be nicer to him. He smiled that CEO smile that means, let's use him until we don't need him anymore. It's the same smile sharks probably have right before they bite. All teeth and no warmth, calculated down to the exact angle that looks friendly in photographs. Eric started inviting me to meetings, patting me on the back like we were old friends, talking about bringing me into the fold and recognizing my contributions with stock options that were basically monopoly money printed on expensive paper. He'd ask my opinion on things and then immediately do the opposite while somehow making it sound like it was my idea all along. The guy was a magician, really. He could make your value disappear while convincing you that you should be grateful for the opportunity to watch. Spoiler alert, they decided they didn't need me about 18 months later, right after I finished implementing the last major upgrade and trained their in-house team on basic maintenance. Suddenly my contract wasn't being renewed, my access was being temporarily restricted for security purposes, and Serena was coming home later and later from important meetings that apparently required her to wear perfume that cost more than our rent. But here's the thing about systems, the thing that Eric and Serena and everyone else at Nexus Data Labs didn't bother to understand because they were too busy counting their money and planning their next power play. Systems remember. They know their real owner. Every line of code I wrote had my fingerprints all over it, my logic, my way of thinking, my particular brand of problem solving that you can't just copy-paste or reverse engineer without understanding the mind that created it. I built backdoors into that system, not for anything malicious, just standard administrator access that any smart developer includes for maintenance and emergency fixes. Primary keys that only I knew about, authentication protocols that required credentials only I possessed, failsafes that would activate if someone tried to lock me out completely. It was like building a house and keeping a master key, except this house was made of data and ran a multi-million-dollar company, and that master key was about to become very, very relevant. They thought they could use me and lose me, thought they could take my work and cut me out like I was some expendable contractor they could replace with anyone who knew how to Google Python tutorial. But the thing about building something from scratch is that it's yours in ways that go deeper than contracts or paychecks or legal ownership. It knows you. It responds to you. And when pushed, it protects you. They just didn't know that yet. The signs were there, bright and obvious as neon billboards on a highway, screaming, "Your wife is cheating on you," in letters tall enough to see from space. But like most people who don't want to believe their world is crumbling around them, I spent a solid 2 months convincing myself I was imagining things, that I was being crazy, that there had to be some perfectly reasonable explanation for why my wife was suddenly acting like a completely different person. It started with the mysterious team dinners that somehow never included me, even though I'd met most of her team, and they all seemed to think I was a pretty okay guy. Serena would get dolled up like she was going to the Oscars, not drinks with Karen from accounting and Brad from marketing, wearing dresses I'd never seen before that must have cost a fortune we supposedly didn't have. When I'd ask if I could tag along, she'd give me this look like I'd just suggested showing up to a business meeting in my underwear. "It's work stuff. You'd be bored," she'd say, kissing my cheek with lips that tasted like lies and expensive lipstick. "Don't wait up." Then there was the perfume. Serena had worn the same perfume since I'd met her, something light and flowery that reminded me of spring, the kind of scent that made you think of sunshine and possibilities. But suddenly, about 3 months after my contract wasn't renewed, she switched to something else entirely. Something heavier, muskier, more expensive. The kind of perfume that didn't whisper, it announced. It screamed, "I'm important, I'm successful, I'm going places," in a cloud of corporate ambition that probably cost $200 an ounce. "New perfume?" I asked one night, trying to sound casual and probably failing miserably. "Oh, this?" "Eric gave it to the whole executive team for hitting our quarterly targets," she said, not even looking up from her phone. Eric. Of course it was Eric. Because nothing says professional workplace gift like expensive French perfume that probably came in a box wrapped with more care than she'd shown our marriage in months. And then there was the phone. The new phone that appeared out of nowhere, sleeker and more expensive than the one she already had, which was already pretty damn nice. She guarded that thing like it contained nuclear launch codes or the secret to immortality. It never left her sight. She took it to the bathroom. She slept with it under her pillow. She'd angle it away from me when texting, fingers flying across the screen with the kind of urgency usually reserved for hostage negotiations or stock market crashes. "Who are you texting?" I asked one evening while we were supposedly watching a movie together, though together was generous since she'd barely looked at the screen in 45 minutes. "Just work stuff," she said, that automatic response that people use when they've practiced lying so much it becomes second nature. Crisis with the Johnson account. Funny thing about the Johnson account, it didn't exist. I knew because I'd built the client database myself, and I'd spent enough time reviewing their systems to know every major account they had. But sure, Serena, tell me more about this fictional crisis that requires you to smile at your phone like it just told you a joke. When I finally confronted her, really confronted her, not the passive-aggressive hints or the casual questions, but the full, "I know something's going on, and you need to tell me the truth" confrontation, she didn't even have the decency to look guilty. We were in our kitchen, that kitchen where we'd cooked dinners together and laughed over terrible cooking attempts, and talked about maybe getting a dog someday when we had more space. Now it just felt like a stage set for a play about a marriage that had already ended. We just hadn't gotten around to announcing it yet. "You're paranoid," she said, loading the dishwasher with the kind of aggressive precision that meant she was definitely not paranoid and I was definitely onto something. "You've been weird ever since you stopped working at Nexus. Maybe if you got another job instead of moping around here, you wouldn't have time to invent problems." Yeah, because paranoia is totally unreasonable when your wife's late-night meetings involve candlelight and her boss's Tesla, that obnoxiously expensive silver one with the vanity plates that said "Shrupt," parked outside Marcello's, the Italian place downtown that cost about $300 a meal and definitely wasn't serving the Johnson account crisis special. I knew because I'd driven past there one Thursday evening when she said she was working late at the office, and there it was, Eric's car gleaming under the streetlights like evidence in a crime scene. I didn't tell her I'd seen it. Didn't mention that I'd also noticed the credit card charges for lingerie I'd never seen her wear, or the way she'd changed her computer password from our anniversary date to something I couldn't guess, or how she'd started going to the gym at 6 in the morning when she used to complain that anything before 9 a.m. was cruel and unusual punishment. So I did what any calm, intelligent, definitely not planning revenge man would do. I waited. Quietly. With receipts. Digital ones, mostly, because that's my specialty. Bank statements, location data from the car's GPS that she forgot I had access to, calendar invites that didn't quite match up with her stories. I compiled it all like I was building a database, because essentially that's what it was, a comprehensive archive of betrayal, meticulously organized and backed up in 3 separate locations because I'm nothing if not thorough. And while she was busy building her career on the foundation of my work and Eric's sleazy mentorship, I was doing something else entirely. I was rewriting the source code, accessing those systems I'd built through backdoors only I knew existed, making small changes here and there that wouldn't be noticeable until they needed to be noticed. Administrative privileges that I'd supposedly lost? Still there, just hidden better. Authentication protocols that should have locked me out? Cute, but I built those locks, and I kept the keys. Revenge wasn't exactly the plan. That makes it sound premeditated and malicious, like I was some kind of villain twirling his mustache and plotting elaborate schemes. No, this was more like insurance. A safety net. A software update that would activate when the time was right. When the universe decided that Eric and Serena needed a reminder that you can't just delete the creator from his own creation. It was just the inevitable consequence of forgetting who really owned the system they were all celebrating. And that time, as it turned out, was coming faster than they thought. Back to the party, where the champagne flowed like water and the fake laughter echoed off the marble walls like a symphony of insincerity. Everyone was dressed to the nines, wearing their success like armor, air-kissing each other's cheeks while probably calculating whose career they could step on to climb one rung higher on the corporate ladder. This was the kind of event where people pretended to like each other for 3 hours, then went home and shit-talked everyone they'd just toasted to on their group chats. I positioned myself near the bar, partially because I needed something to do with my hands and partially because bartenders see everything and judge nothing, making them the most honest people in any room full of liars. The bartender tonight was this guy named Miguel who'd clearly worked enough corporate events to know exactly what he was looking at. A man who'd just walked into his own public humiliation and was somehow smiling about it. He poured me a sparkling water without me even asking, sliding it across the polished counter with the kind of knowing look that said, "I got you, buddy." I sipped that sparkling water like it was vintage whiskey, because someone had to stay sober enough to enjoy what was coming. And it definitely wasn't going to be the CFO, who was already 3 martinis deep and laughing too loud at jokes that weren't funny. Around me, Nexus Data Lab's finest were networking with the intensity of sharks circling chum, exchanging business cards and LinkedIn profiles like they were trading baseball cards, everyone trying to out-important each other with stories about deals they'd closed and clients they'd landed. I recognized most of them. There was Janet from HR, who'd sent me the "thank you for your service" email when they'd terminated my contract, dressed in a pantsuit that probably cost more than they'd paid me in my last month. Richard from sales was holding court near the hors d'oeuvres table, telling the same exaggerated story about landing the Peterson account that I'd heard at least 5 times, conveniently leaving out the part where the system I'd built was the only reason they could handle Peterson's data requirements. And there was Amanda, one of the junior developers I'd actually trained, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable when she caught my eye from across the room. Then Serena made her entrance, and I swear the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees just from the ice in her veins. She strutted across that ballroom floor in her silver dress like she owned the place, heels clicking against marble with the confidence of someone who'd forgotten that confidence and I used to build together, back when we were a team instead of whatever legal definition our marriage had been reduced to. Her hair was done up in some complicated style that probably required an engineering degree to achieve, makeup flawless, every inch of her screaming, "I made it, and I don't need you anymore." Eric appeared at her side like a trained dog, except this dog drove a Tesla and made 7 figures a year. He had his hand on her lower back again, that possessive gesture that made my jaw clench, and they worked the room together like a presidential couple on the campaign trail, shaking hands and accepting congratulations for a success story that conveniently forgot to mention the guy who'd actually written the code that made it all possible. The string quartet switched to something triumphant and insufferable as Eric moved toward the small stage they'd set up near the massive screens. Someone handed him a microphone, and the lights dimmed slightly for dramatic effect, because apparently this wasn't just a company anniversary party. It was a TED Talk waiting to happen. Eric tapped his champagne glass with that little fork thing that rich people use to get attention, and the room obediently quieted down like school children when the principal walks in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eric began, his voice booming through the sound system with practiced ease. "Tonight we celebrate innovation and loyalty." I almost choked on my sparkling water. Innovation? Sure, if you count stealing someone else's work as innovation. Loyalty? Coming from the guy who'd called me background noise in an email that was accidentally CC'd to me instead of just Serena, an email where he'd literally written, "We can replace him with any competent developer once the system is stable." I'd saved that email, obviously, because I'm not an idiot, and it was currently sitting in a folder labeled Receipts, along with about 40 other pieces of evidence that these people were terrible human beings. Security was still hovering near me. These two guys built like refrigerators in cheap suits, watching me like I might suddenly flip a table or start screaming profanities at the happy couple on stage. One of them, the shorter one with the buzz cut, kept touching his earpiece like he was receiving updates from Mission Control about the dangerous ex-husband situation. I gave him a friendly wave. The buzz-cut guy did not wave back. Eric continued his speech, something about building the future together and the power of teamwork and other corporate buzzwords that probably sounded profound to people who'd had too much champagne, but really just meant, "We made money and we're proud of ourselves." People nodded along like he was revealing the secrets of the universe instead of reading from the same playbook every tech CEO has used since Silicon Valley became a thing. Serena stood near the stage, beaming up at Eric like he'd just discovered fire, her face a mask of admiration that I used to think was reserved for me back when I was naive enough to believe that love meant something more than convenience and career advancement. She applauded at all the right moments, laughed at his jokes that weren't actually jokes, played her role perfectly in this theater of corporate ambition. Behind them, those massive screens displayed the Nexus Data Labs logo, pulsing gently with animations that I designed during a 72-hour coding marathon fueled by energy drinks and the mistaken belief that hard work would be rewarded. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nothing about this situation was lost on me. I checked my watch. Any minute now, Eric was going to transition from his speech into the big presentation, the one where they'd showcase all their achievements and growth metrics and profit margins, all displayed through the system that apparently didn't need its creator anymore. The presentation that required administrator access to run properly, access that they thought they had but really didn't. Miguel the bartender caught my eye and raised an eyebrow, a silent question of whether I needed anything stronger than sparkling water for whatever was about to happen. I shook my head. I wanted to remember every single second of this with perfect clarity. On stage, Eric raised his glass for a toast, and 300 people raised theirs in response. A sea of champagne flutes glittering under the chandelier light, like complicit witnesses to their own upcoming disaster. "To Nexus Data Labs," Eric proclaimed, his voice dripping with self-satisfaction, "and to the brilliant future we're building together." I raised my sparkling water, smiling like I was in on the joke. I was the only one who knew the punchline was about to hit. Eric pointed at me again, his finger jabbing through the air like he was trying to physically push me out of the building through sheer force of will. His face had gone that particular shade of red that powerful men turn when someone has the audacity to not immediately obey them, like a tomato having an existential crisis. I said, "Escort him out." He barked at the security guards, who honestly looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else than in the middle of this increasingly awkward domestic situation masquerading as a security threat. The two guards grabbed my arms with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested they were trying to do their jobs without actually hurting anyone or becoming YouTube famous for excessive force. "Sir, please leave quietly," the buzzcut one said, his voice surprisingly polite considering his boss was practically frothing at the mouth behind him. I looked at both of them, then at Eric, then at the 300 people watching this unfold like it was the season finale of their favorite drama series. Quietly, I laughed, the sound echoing across the now silent ballroom in a way that probably made me look unhinged, But honestly, I'd pass caring about that somewhere around the time I found out my wife was screwing her boss. Sure, I can do quiet, but you might want to back up your data first. It was such a casual comment, delivered with the kind of tone you'd use to mention that it might rain later or that the coffee was getting cold. But I saw it, that microscopic flicker of uncertainty that crossed Eric's face, the way his eyes narrowed just slightly, the mental calculation happening behind them as his brain tried to figure out if I was bluffing or if I actually had the power to do what I was implying. That's when the lights dimmed. Just slightly, just enough for people to notice, just enough for conversations to pause mid-sentence and heads to turn upward toward the chandeliers like maybe the hotel was having electrical issues. But I knew better. The hotel's electrical system was fine. It was the massive power draw from the screens behind the stage suddenly trying to load data that wasn't there anymore, processors working overtime to find files that had been quietly relocated to places only I could access. I smiled. I couldn't help it. It was like watching the first domino tip over in a chain reaction you'd spent months setting up. One of the engineers from Nexus's IT department, a nervous kid named Tyler who looked like he'd graduated college about 15 minutes ago, appeared from the wings of the stage area, his tablet clutched in his hands like a life preserver, sweat already forming on his forehead. He whispered something urgently to Eric, gesturing at his screen with the kind of frantic energy that usually precedes very bad news. Eric waved him off with the irritated dismissal of someone who'd spent his entire career believing that technical problems could be solved by simply telling them to go away. "Restart it," he said, not even looking at Tyler, still too focused on glaring at me like I was personally responsible for every inconvenience he'd ever experienced. Which, to be fair, I was about to be. Tyler scurried away like a kicked puppy, probably already texting the rest of the IT team with a message that roughly translated to "we're so screwed." I watched him go, still held by the two security guards who were getting increasingly uncomfortable with their role in this little drama. "Yeah, Eric," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet room with perfect clarity. "Restart it. That should definitely help. Have you tried turning it off and on again?" A few people actually laughed at that. Nervous, quickly suppressed laughter, but laughter nonetheless. The kind that escapes when tension gets so thick you either laugh or scream. And most people in corporate America have been trained since birth to never scream in public. Even Serena's perfectly maintained composure cracked for just a second, her eyes widening as she finally seemed to realize that maybe I hadn't shown up tonight just to cause a scene. Maybe I'd shown up for something far more calculated. The screens behind Eric, those massive displays that were supposed to show graphs and metrics and all the proof of Nexus Data Lab's incredible success, flickered once, then twice, then went completely black, like someone had pulled the plug on the entire presentation, except nobody had touched any plugs because there were no plugs to touch. Everything ran wirelessly through the system I'd built, the system that was currently deciding it didn't feel like cooperating anymore. You could have heard a pin drop in that ballroom. 300 people collectively held their breath, watching those blank screens like they were waiting for a miracle or a disaster, unable to tell which one was coming. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely, their instruments frozen mid-note, the cellist's bow hovering above her strings as she watched the chaos unfold with the fascinated detachment of someone who was getting paid either way. Tyler reappeared, practically sprinting this time, his tablet screen illuminated with what I knew, because I designed the error messages myself, was a very specific, very deliberate notification. He thrust it at Eric, pointing at something on the display, his voice rising above whisper level into the range of barely controlled panic. "Sir, something's wrong with the system," Tyler said, stating the obvious with the kind of helpful clarity that people resort to when their brain is short-circuiting. "We can't access the main servers. The backup authentication isn't working. It's like everything's locked." Eric finally tore his attention away from me to look at the tablet, his face transitioning from angry red to confused pale in about 3 seconds flat. I watched his eyes scan the screen, watched the exact moment he started to understand that this wasn't just a technical glitch or bad timing or the universe conspiring against his perfect evening. This was deliberate. This was personal. This was me. "What's happening?" Serena stammered from her position near the stage, her voice losing that confident edge she'd been carrying all night. replaced by something that almost sounded like fear. She looked at Eric, then at Tyler, then finally at me, and I saw the calculation happening behind her eyes, the pieces slowly clicking into place. I shrugged. The gesture made slightly awkward by the fact that two security guards were still holding my arms, though their grip had loosened considerably as they too tried to figure out what the hell was going on. "Looks like the system doesn't recognize you anymore," I said, keeping my voice conversational, like we were discussing the weather or traffic patterns instead of the complete meltdown of a multi-million-dollar company's infrastructure. "Fix it now," Eric shouted at Tyler, his voice cracking slightly on the last word, authority giving way to desperation. But Tyler just stood there, shaking his head, looking at his tablet like it had personally betrayed him. I chuckled, the sound low and genuinely amused. "Can't fix it, Eric. See, here's the thing about systems. They need their primary administrator to function properly. And you just tried to throw him out of the building." That's when understanding finally dawned on Eric's face. That beautiful moment of realization when someone figures out they've made a catastrophic mistake, but it's way too late to fix it. Then it appeared, blazing across every single screen in the ballroom like the world's most expensive error message, rendered in that clinical, sans serif font that somehow made it look even more damning. Primary key missing. Not system error, or please wait, or any of the vague, reassuring messages that usually appear when technology hiccups. No, this was specific, technical, and for anyone who understood even basic database architecture, absolutely devastating. Every single screen. The massive displays behind the stage, the smaller monitors set up around the room for overflow viewing, even the digital sign by the entrance that had been cycling through the evening's agenda. All of them now showed the same message, pulsing gently like a heartbeat, like the system itself was announcing its own death. The CFO, Thomas something or other, a guy who'd probably never written a line of code in his life, but loved to talk about leveraging synergies and optimizing workflows, dropped his martini glass. Tablets came out. Phones were frantically unlocked, and I could see them forming an impromptu crisis huddle, their voices rising in that particular pitch that technical people use when something has gone catastrophically wrong, and they're trying to figure out whose fault it is before management does. Tyler was typing so fast on his tablet, I thought his fingers might catch fire, his face illuminated by the screen's glow as he pulled up diagnostics and system logs and probably every troubleshooting guide he'd ever bookmarked. Next to him, Sarah from cybersecurity, a woman I'd actually respected back when I worked there because she was one of the few people who'd actually understood what I was building, had gone completely white, her expression suggesting she'd just realized the magnitude of what they were dealing with. "This isn't possible," she muttered, loud enough for people around her to hear. "The backup systems should have kicked in. The redundancies should have prevented this. Unless..." She trailed off, her eyes widening as she looked up from her device and locked eyes with me across the room. She knew. Of all the people in this building, Sarah was probably the only one besides me who understood exactly what primary key missing meant, and more importantly, what it meant that no backup was working. Someone in the crowd, one of the investors based on his expensive watch and the way he carried himself like money was his first language, shouted, "What does that mean? What's a primary key?" His companion, a woman in a red dress who'd been laughing at Eric's jokes 5 minutes ago, tried to explain. "It's like the master password? The main access point." She looked around for confirmation, but the tech team was too busy having coordinated mental breakdowns to educate the masses on database architecture. Another investor, this older gentleman who I recognized from the board meetings I used to sit in on back when they pretended to value my input, pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my broker," he announced to no one in particular. "If their systems are down, their stock is going to tank tomorrow." That started a chain reaction. Suddenly, everyone with Nexus Data Labs stock, which was most of the room, considering they'd gone public 8 months ago in an IPO that had been called the tech success story of the year by several financial publications, was pulling out their phones, making calls, sending texts, probably triggering sell orders before the news hit the wider market. The soft glow of phone screens illuminated the ballroom like a constellation of tiny warnings that the ship was sinking and the rats were already swimming for shore. Janet from HR, the same Janet who'd sent me that "thank you for your service" email without a trace of actual gratitude, was trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Everyone please remain calm," she called out in that practiced HR voice that's supposed to be soothing, but just makes everyone more anxious. "I'm sure this is just a minor technical difficulty." But even she didn't sound convinced, and the way she kept glancing at Eric with increasing panic suggested she was already mentally updating her own resume. Near the hors d'oeuvres table, which was now completely abandoned because apparently caviar loses its appeal when your company is imploding, Richard from sales was having a very animated conversation on his phone. "No, don't sign the contract yet," he was saying, his voice carrying across the room. "Just wait until tomorrow. Something's come up." The something in question being the complete and total failure of the infrastructure that made their entire business model possible. But sure, Richard, undersell it a little more. Amanda, the junior developer I trained, finally worked up the courage to approach the security guards who were still technically holding me, though at this point it was more like we were all standing together watching the same disaster movie. She said hesitantly, looking at me with an expression that mixed guilt, understanding, and what might have been a tiny bit of admiration. Is this my fault?" I finished for her, smiling. "No, Amanda, this is their fault. I just stopped preventing the inevitable." She nodded slowly, like she was processing something she'd suspected but never confirmed, then backed away to rejoin her panicking colleagues. At least she'd had the decency to acknowledge me, which was more than most of them had done when they'd escorted me out 3 months ago. The string quartet, bless them, tried to resume playing, some light classical number that was probably meant to calm everyone down, but gave up after about 30 seconds when it became clear that nobody was listening and the vibe had shifted from elegant corporate celebration to Titanic after it hit the iceberg. Eric's face had transitioned through several colors in rapid succession: red, pale, purple, and now settling on a kind of grayish tone that suggested his blood pressure was doing things blood pressure definitely shouldn't do. He was barking orders at Tyler and the tech team, but they were all talking over each other, a cacophony of technical jargon and increasingly desperate suggestions. "Reboot everything. We can't. We don't have admin access. What about the cloud backup?" "The cloud backup requires authentication from the primary server, which is locked," Sarah finished, her voice flat with the resignation of someone who'd just realized they were completely, utterly screwed. Serena stood frozen near the stage, her silver dress now looking less like a fashion statement and more like a costume for a play that had gone horribly wrong. She was staring at the screens with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, certainly, but also something else. Recognition, maybe. The slow dawning understanding that the quiet guy in the background, the one she'd helped push out, the one whose work she'd built her reputation on, had just proven exactly how essential he'd been all along. The buzzcut security guard finally let go of my arm completely. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think maybe we should let him stay." His partner nodded in agreement. "Yeah, something tells me he's not the problem here." I appreciated their evolving understanding of the situation. It restored a little bit of my faith in humanity, or at least in security guards who were smarter than the people paying them. Miguel, still behind the bar because apparently bartenders stay at their posts no matter what kind of chaos unfolds, caught my eye and gave me a slight nod of respect. He'd seen a lot of things in his career, but this was probably going to be a story he told at other gigs for years. The time I watched a guy single-handedly destroy a tech company with an error message. Someone from accounting, I think her name was Patricia, actually started crying. "My stock options," she sobbed to her colleague. "I was going to buy a house." Her colleague, trying to be comforting but clearly panicking himself, patted her shoulder. "Maybe it's temporary. Maybe they can fix it." But they couldn't fix it. That was the beautiful, terrifying, absolutely perfect part. Every person in that tech team knew it, even if they weren't ready to admit it yet. You can't fix a system that's been locked by the person who built it, not without his cooperation, not without the credentials and access that only he possessed. They could try to rebuild from scratch, sure, but that would take months, maybe years, and in the meantime, every transaction, every client interaction, every piece of data that Nexus Data Labs needed to function, all of it was trapped behind a door that only I had the key to. Eric finally turned back to me, his expression a mixture of rage and something that might have been desperation if he'd been humble enough to feel desperate. Our eyes met across the ballroom, across the wreckage of his perfect evening, across the smoking ruins of the empire he thought he'd built. "You," he said, the single word carrying more venom than I'd thought possible. "You did this." I raised my glass of sparkling water in a mock toast, smiled my best smile, the one I usually reserve for ironic situations and karmic justice. "No, Eric, you did this. I just stopped cleaning up your mess." And that's when the real panic began. Panic spread through that ballroom like wildfire through a drought-stricken forest, fast and merciless and absolutely unstoppable. What had started as confused murmuring escalated into full-blown chaos in about 30 seconds flat, which honestly might be a record for corporate meltdown speed. I should check the Guinness Book for that one. The phones started ringing first, not the cell phones that everyone was already clutching like lifelines, but the actual business lines that people apparently still carried because they thought it made them look important. The sound was cacophonous, a symphony of different ringtones, all competing for attention, each one probably bringing worse news than the last. I watched as face after face went pale, as voices rose in pitch and urgency, as the reality of what was happening spread from person to person like the world's worst game of telephone. "The payment portal is down," someone shouted from near the entrance, a guy in a gray suit who I vaguely recognized as being from the finance department. He had his phone pressed so hard against his ear I thought he might accidentally merge with it. "Clients can't process transactions. They're calling the emergency line and nobody can help them because we can't access the system." That was met with another wave of panic. See, Nexus Data Labs wasn't just some random tech company playing with apps and social media algorithms. They processed actual financial transactions for actual clients who moved actual money. Lots of it. When your entire business model depends on being able to facilitate secure data transfers, and your system suddenly decides to take an unscheduled vacation, that's not just embarrassing. That's the kind of thing that gets you sued, investigated, and potentially shut down by multiple regulatory agencies who are very interested in why you can't protect your client's data. Near the stage, Tyler had been joined by what looked like the entire IT department, all of them crowded around tablets and laptops that had been hastily set up on a table meant for champagne flutes. Their faces were illuminated by screen glow, making them look like characters in a horror movie, which honestly wasn't that far from the truth. They were typing frantically, pulling up command prompts and diagnostic tools, probably running through every troubleshooting protocol they'd ever learned in their computer science degrees and finding absolutely nothing that worked. "Try the secondary authentication," one of them shouted. I think it was Marcus, the guy who'd originally gotten me this gig back when we were friends, and he didn't realize he was hiring the instrument of his company's destruction. "Already did," Tyler shot back, his voice cracking with stress. "It requires administrator approval, which requires credentials we don't have," Sarah finished, slamming her laptop shut with enough force that several people nearby flinched. She ran her hands through her hair, destroying the professional styling she'd probably spent an hour on this morning. "This is insane. Every single failsafe, every backup protocol, every redundancy system, they all route back to the primary administrator access. And we don't have it. We never actually had it." The implications of that statement rippled through the tech team like a shockwave. They all turned, almost in unison, to look at Eric, who was still standing near the stage looking like he'd been personally betrayed by the concept of technology itself. His expensive suit was rumpled now, his perfectly styled hair had been run through with anxious fingers enough times that it stuck up in weird angles, and there was a visible sweat stain spreading under his arms that his designer fabric was doing its best, but failing to hide. "What do you mean we never had it?" Eric demanded, his voice hitting that dangerous pitch that powerful men use when they're about to fire someone and want everyone to know they're very serious and very angry about being made to look stupid. Sarah actually laughed, a sharp, slightly hysterical sound. "I mean exactly what I said, Eric. The administrator access you thought you had? It was provisional, limited. It only worked because the actual administrator." She pointed directly at me, and suddenly every eye in the room followed her finger like I was the star witness in a murder trial. "Allowed it to work. He built in master overrides that superseded everything. And now that he's revoked that access, we're locked out of our own system. You could have heard a pin drop. Actually, you could have heard a feather drop. Hell, You could have heard someone thinking about dropping something and deciding against it. One of the younger engineers, a kid fresh out of MIT, who probably still had his graduation tassel hanging from his rearview mirror, stood up so fast his chair fell backwards. The backup. He practically shouted, like he'd just solved world hunger and cured cancer simultaneously. We have comprehensive backups. We can restore from those and rebuild the access. For about 3 seconds, hope flickered across the faces of everyone from Nexus Data Labs. Eric actually straightened up, his expression shifting from defeated to cautiously optimistic. Serena, still frozen in her silver dress like a very expensive statue, took a step forward. Even some of the investors stopped their panicked phone calls to listen. Then Sarah, bless her technical accuracy and inability to sugarcoat reality, shook her head. The backups are encrypted, she said flatly. They require authentication from the primary server to decrypt, which requires administrator access. The MIT kid finished, his face falling as the brief spark of hope extinguished like someone had thrown a bucket of ice water on it. He picked up his chair and sat back down with the defeated slump of someone who just realized they were completely and utterly screwed. The backup is useless without the original administrator, Tyler yelled, his voice carrying across the ballroom with the kind of clarity that usually requires a microphone. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. More like he was yelling at the universe itself, at the fundamental unfairness of a situation where they'd built their entire company on someone else's foundation and then acted surprised when they couldn't operate without him. The phrase echoed across the room, bouncing off those marble walls and crystal chandeliers, settling into the consciousness of every person who'd ever taken credit for work they didn't do or pushed out someone they thought was expendable. The backup is nothing without the original. It was almost poetic, really. A metaphor so perfect it could have been a bumper sticker or one of those motivational posters that tech companies love to hang in their break rooms. Except this one was less about inspiration and more about karmic justice served cold. Serena's face turned ghost white, every trace of color draining from her complexion until she looked like she might actually pass out. She grabbed the edge of the stage for support, her knuckles going white with the pressure. Her eyes found mine across the room, and for the first time since I'd walked through those doors tonight, I saw something that wasn't contempt or indifference. I saw fear. Raw, genuine, oh God, what have I done fear. Eric had started sweating profusely now, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of panic in a combination that probably violated several Geneva Convention protocols. He pulled out his phone, hands shaking slightly as he tried to dial someone. Probably his lawyer, maybe his PR team, possibly a priest, because at this point divine intervention might be his best option. But before he could complete the call, his phone rang first. The look on his face when he saw the caller ID suggested it was not good news. Hello, he answered, his voice trying for authoritative and landing somewhere around desperate. Yes, this is Eric Langford. What? No, we're experiencing a temporary. He was cut off by whoever was on the other end, and I watched his face cycle through several more shades of panic. I understand that, but another interruption. We're working on it right now, I assure you. More talking from the other end that I couldn't hear, but could definitely interpret based on Eric's increasingly frantic expression. 24 hours? We can't possibly. The person on the other end apparently didn't care what he could or couldn't do, because Eric's shoulders sagged in defeat. Yes, I understand. We'll do everything we can. He hung up and looked around at the assembled chaos like a captain watching his ship sink. That was the Thornton Group, he said to no one and everyone simultaneously. They're threatening to pull their contract if we don't have systems operational within 24 hours. That's 40% of our revenue. The ballroom erupted into fresh chaos. 40% of revenue disappearing would tank the company faster than you could say bankruptcy filing. More phones came out, more panicked conversations began. More people started doing the mental math on how quickly they could find new jobs before this mess hit their resumes. I remained exactly where I was, leaning against the bar with my sparkling water, watching the dominoes continue to fall in exactly the pattern I predicted they would. Miguel the bartender was watching too, occasionally shaking his head with the weary understanding of someone who'd served drinks at enough corporate events to know that karma was real and she was savage. You know, I said, loud enough for the people near me to hear, my voice cutting through the chaos with casual observation. Maybe next time you should back up your morals before your data. Might have saved you some trouble. There was a beat of stunned silence, and then something unexpected happened. People actually laughed. Not everyone. Eric certainly didn't, and Serena looked like she might throw up, but enough people that it carried across the room. Quiet laughter, uncomfortable laughter, the kind that escapes when a situation is so absurd and terrible that your brain doesn't know how else to process it. Some of it was definitely nervous energy, but some of it, I think, was genuine appreciation for the poetry of the moment. Even a few of the Nexus employees cracked smiles, quickly hidden, but definitely there. Turns out when you treat people like disposable resources, they're not super upset when karma catches up with management. I raised my glass of sparkling water. To the room, to the chaos, to the beautiful catastrophe unfolding before me like a symphony I'd composed but never had to play. To poetic justice, I announced. May she always remember the people who forgot to read the fine print. Several people actually clinked their glasses with mine as I held it up, including one of the investors who apparently had a sense of humor about losing money, or maybe just appreciated a well-executed revenge plot when he saw one. The meltdown was complete. The system was down. The company was crumbling. And for the first time in months, I felt absolutely, perfectly at peace. Was making my way toward the exit, because honestly there was nothing left to see here except grown adults having coordinated panic attacks, when Eric materialized in front of me like a very angry, very sweaty ghost. He must have pushed through about 30 people to get to me that fast, leaving a wake of startled guests and probably a few spilled drinks. His face was inches from mine, close enough that I could smell the desperation mixed with whatever expensive aftershave he'd doused himself in this morning when he thought tonight was going to be his triumphant celebration. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous, like he thought intimidation would somehow work on the guy who'd just brought his entire company to its knees with a few lines of code. "What the hell did you do to my system?" I actually smiled at that. Couldn't help it. "Your system?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the air between us like a challenge. "That's interesting. See, I didn't do anything, Eric. I really didn't. You just removed the wrong guy." His jaw clenched so hard I thought he might crack a molar, and honestly that would have been icing on the cake at this point. "Don't play games with me," he hissed. "This is sabotage. This is illegal. I'll have you arrested for." "For what?" I interrupted, keeping my voice calm and reasonable, which I could tell was pissing him off even more than if I'd been yelling. "For revoking my own administrator access to a system I built? For protecting intellectual property that belongs to me? Go ahead, call the cops. I'll wait." I made a show of checking my watch. "Should I call them for you? I've got nothing but time now that I'm unemployed and all." "The system belongs to the company," Eric shouted, loud enough that several conversations around us stopped as people turned to watch this confrontation unfold. His face had gone that deep purple color again, the one that suggested his blood pressure was doing things his doctor would definitely not approve of. "You were paid to develop it. That makes it company property." I reached into my jacket pocket, moving slowly because the security guards were still hovering nearby, and I didn't want them getting jumpy, and pulled out my phone. A few swipes, and I had what I needed. The document I'd been carrying around like a lucky charm for the past 3 months. The one piece of leverage I'd known would eventually become relevant. "Actually," I said, turning the phone so he could see the screen, "that's not quite how it works." On the display was the original startup contract, the one I'd signed back when Nexus Data Labs was just a struggling company desperate for someone to build them something that wouldn't fall apart. I'd been young and naive, but not stupid enough to sign away all my rights, so I'd included a clause, buried in the legal jargon where most people don't bother to read, that specified intellectual property ownership would be shared, with the creator maintaining primary administrative rights. "See this?" I pointed at the relevant paragraph, highlighted in yellow for easy reference. "This says that the infrastructure belongs to its creator." That would be me. And this part here. I scrolled down, pointing to another section. "This says primary administrative access cannot be transferred without written consent of the creator." Guess who signed it first? Guess who never gave written consent to transfer that access? Eric's face drained of color faster than water down a drain, going from angry purple to corpse pale in about 2 seconds. His eyes scanned the document, his lips moving slightly as he read. and I watched in real time as he realized just how badly his legal team had screwed up. Or maybe they hadn't screwed up at all. Maybe he'd just never bothered to read the fine print, too confident in his own importance to think that a contract with some freelance developer would ever come back to bite him. "This can't be legal," he stammered, but his voice had lost all its conviction. "Our lawyers would have caught this." "They would have." "Would have what?" I asked. "Actually read the contract?" "Yeah, that would have been smart. But see, your lawyers were probably more focused on protecting the company from external threats. They never imagined the threat would come from the guy you thought was too insignificant to matter." Behind Eric, I could see Serena pushing through the crowd, her silver dress catching the light as she moved with the kind of urgency that suggested she'd finally understood the magnitude of what was happening. She reached us just as Eric was opening his mouth to respond, probably to threaten me with more legal action that wouldn't go anywhere, and she did something I hadn't expected. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my jacket sleeve, her face a mask of desperation that I'd never seen before. The Ice Queen had melted, and what was left was someone who'd just realized her entire carefully constructed career was built on a foundation that was actively crumbling beneath her feet. "Can't you fix this?" she whispered, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the chaos in the ballroom. "Please, please fix it. We can work something out. We can talk about this." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then up at her face, and something inside me that used to love her, that used to believe we were partners, that used to think she was worth building a life with, felt absolutely nothing. Just a hollow space where affection used to live. "Funny," I said, gently removing her hand from my arm like I was peeling off a piece of tape. "That's the first time you've said please since our wedding." "Actually, no. You said please when you wanted me to cover for you with your mother about that business trip to San Francisco. The one where you stayed at the Four Seasons with Eric." I saw her flinch at that, saw the confirmation in her eyes even though she didn't say anything. "But please fix your career? Please save the reputation you built on my work?" "That's a new one." "I never meant," she started, but I was already turning away, already walking toward those glass doors that led out of this glittering nightmare and into the cool night air that suddenly seemed a lot more appealing than anything inside this building. Eric's voice rose behind me, sharp with panic. "You can't just leave. We need to fix this. Name your price. Anything. Just name it." I paused at the doors, looked back at the scene I was leaving behind, the chaos, the panic, the important people who suddenly weren't so important anymore, and smiled. "My price is watching you realize that some people aren't for sale, Eric. Some people actually meant it when they said marriage vows. Some people don't build their success by stepping on everyone who helped them. And some people remember who their friends were before they got too important to return phone calls." I pushed through the doors while Eric screamed into his phone like it was a lifeline, his voice echoing across the marble and crystal and expensive devastation. But it wasn't a lifeline. It was just another piece of technology that couldn't save him from the consequences of his own actions. Not anymore. As I reached those massive glass doors, something unexpected happened. Something that I definitely hadn't planned for, but was going to replay in my head for years to come like the world's most satisfying movie scene. Applause broke out behind me. Actual, genuine, sustained applause that started somewhere near the back of the ballroom and rippled forward like a wave, building in volume until it filled the entire space with the kind of sound usually reserved for rock concerts and standing ovations. Not for Eric, not for Serena, not for the company that was currently experiencing a meltdown of biblical proportions. For me, for the guy who'd been escorted out of meetings, dismissed as background noise, and treated like his contributions were as forgettable as yesterday's weather forecast. I stopped with my hand on the door handle, turned around, and just soaked it in. 300 employees who had watched me get humiliated, who'd seen me built up just enough to be torn down, who'd witnessed Serena parade around with Eric while I became the office ghost story that people didn't talk about in polite company. They were all clapping. Some of them were even standing, their champagne flutes forgotten on tables and trays, their faces showing expressions that ranged from respect to barely suppressed glee. The buzzcut security guard who'd tried to escort me out earlier was clapping too, a huge grin on his face. His partner had his hands cupped around his mouth and actually shouted, "Hell yeah," which probably violated about 17 company policies, but who was going to enforce those now? Janet from HR? She was too busy having an existential crisis near the stage. Amanda, the junior developer I'd trained, was clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. Next to her, Marcus, my old college buddy who'd gotten me into this mess in the first place, gave me a salute that was part respect, part apology, and entirely deserved. Even some of the investors were clapping, including the older gentleman who'd threatened to call his broker earlier. He raised his glass to me with a nod that suggested he appreciated a well-executed power play when he saw one, even if it was costing him money. Miguel the bartender was doing the slow clap, the kind you see in movies when someone's about to give an inspiring speech, except this wasn't a movie and there was no speech. Just me, standing in a doorway, watching the people who'd forgotten I existed suddenly remember exactly how much they'd needed me all along. Even the DJ looked impressed, and this was a guy who probably spun at corporate events 3 times a week and thought he'd seen everything. He actually stopped the ambient music he'd been playing, because apparently he'd kept working through the entire system meltdown like the professional he was, and the sudden silence made the applause even more dramatic. His playlist had nothing on my timing, and from the look on his face, he knew it. Eric wasn't clapping. He was standing near the stage with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand, while presumably getting screamed at by another client or investor, or possibly his mother, who would definitely be disappointed in how this evening had turned out. Serena wasn't clapping either. She'd sunk into one of those ridiculously expensive chairs they'd rented for the event, her silver dress pooling around her like liquid mercury, her face buried in her hands in a pose that would have made a great album cover for a country song about regret and poor life choices. Tyler and the tech team weren't clapping because they were too busy frantically typing on their laptops, probably trying to find some miraculous workaround that didn't exist, but a few of them looked up long enough to give me nods of acknowledgement. Sarah actually stopped what she was doing to give me a full standing ovation, and I appreciated that. She'd always been one of the good ones, someone who understood that systems were built by people, not manifested out of thin air by CEO charisma and quarterly earnings reports. I gave the room a small bow. Nothing too dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that yes, I was aware of the applause, and yes, I was absolutely savoring every second of it. Then I pushed through those doors and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and the sound of 300 people who just learned a very valuable lesson about reading contracts and treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources. Outside, the night air felt different. Lighter. Honest. The kind of air that doesn't lie to you about late-night meetings or team dinners or business trips to San Francisco. The October breeze carried the smell of the city, exhaust fumes, street food from the vendors that set up on the corner, that indefinable scent that big cities have that's somehow both grimy and alive. And it was infinitely more appealing than the expensive catering and fake politeness I'd just left behind. The valet parking attendant, a young guy who probably made minimum wage to stand outside in the cold and fetch cars for people who thought tipping was optional, watched me emerge from the gala with wide eyes. Sir? Do you need your car?" he asked hesitantly, probably wondering if I was about to cause a scene in his section of the world too. "Yeah," I said, handing him my ticket. "And you might want to stay out here for the next hour or so. It's about to get real messy in there." He glanced at the glass doors, through which you could still see the chaos unfolding in the ballroom, and nodded slowly. "Worse than it already is?" "So much worse," I confirmed, and slipped him a 20 because he'd been polite and seemed like a decent kid who deserved a heads up about the exodus that was probably going to happen when people started fleeing this disaster like rats from a sinking ship. My phone, which I'd silenced during the festivities because I'd wanted to enjoy the show without distractions, suddenly started buzzing like it was having a seizure. Notifications poured in so fast the screen couldn't keep up. Texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, even a couple of voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and started scrolling through the chaos. Job offers. Holy shit, the job offers. At least 10 of them already. From companies ranging from startups to massive tech corporations. All of them apparently having heard through the industry grapevine about what had just gone down at the Grandview Hotel. News traveled fast in Silicon Valley, and news about a developer taking down an entire company by revoking his own access traveled at light speed. Saw what happened at Nexus. Very interested in discussing opportunities. Name your price. That was from TechCore, a company I'd interviewed with last year before deciding to go with Nexus because Serena had been so excited about us working in the same building. We need someone who actually understands system security. Are you available? DataBridge Industries, offering a six-figure salary right there in the text message like they were afraid someone else would snap me up first. Partnership deals, consulting offers, even a message from a venture capitalist who wanted to fund whatever I wanted to build next, because apparently publicly destroying your former employer's infrastructure was the new way to prove you were worth investing in. The tech industry was weird, but I wasn't complaining. And then, buried in the avalanche of professional opportunities and congratulations from people I barely knew, there was one text from Serena. Just 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment, standing there on the sidewalk while the valet went to get my car, the sounds of the city humming around me like a soundtrack to my newfound freedom. We need to talk. The classic phrase of someone who'd realized they'd screwed up, but wasn't quite ready to admit it out loud. The opening line of a conversation that would probably involve apologies and excuses and justifications for why she'd done what she'd done, all wrapped up in the kind of emotional manipulation that people use when they want you to forget they'd stabbed you in the back. I could have responded with a lot of things. I could have written a long message about trust and betrayal and how she'd taken the foundation we built together and used it to elevate herself while pushing me down. I could have told her exactly how many nights I'd spent lying awake wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently, how I could have been better, before finally realizing that none of it was my fault and all of it was her choice. Instead, I opened my photos, found the screenshot I'd taken earlier of those massive screens displaying their error message, and sent it to her without any commentary. Just the image, primary key missing, rendered in that cold, clinical font against a black background. Some metaphors write themselves, and this one didn't need any explanation. The backup was nothing without the original. The system didn't work without its creator. The foundation crumbles when you remove the person who built it, and then act surprised when everything falls apart. 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing a response. Then they disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared again. Whatever she was trying to say, she couldn't find the words. And honestly, that was probably the most honest communication we'd had in months. My car arrived, the valet hopping out and holding the door open with a knowing smile that suggested he'd figured out I was somehow responsible for whatever disaster was unfolding inside. I tipped him another 20, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look at the Grandview Hotel, at the glass doors and marble facade, and all that expensive architecture that housed expensive people having expensive problems. Then I drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of their success story and the ruins of my marriage, heading toward whatever came next with a phone full of opportunities and a heart that was finally starting to feel lighter than it had in months. Exit, stage left. The show was over, and I'd gotten my standing ovation. As I reached those massive glass doors, something unexpected happened. Something that I definitely hadn't planned for, but was going to replay in my head for years to come like the world's most satisfying movie scene. Applause broke out behind me. Actual, genuine, sustained applause that started somewhere near the back of the ballroom and rippled forward like a wave, building in volume until it filled the entire space with the kind of sound usually reserved for rock concerts and standing ovations. Not for Eric. Not for Serena. Not for the company that was currently experiencing a meltdown of biblical proportions. For me. For the guy who'd been escorted out of meetings, dismissed as background noise, and treated like his contributions were as forgettable as yesterday's weather forecast. I stopped with my hand on the door handle, turned around, and just soaked it in. 300 employees who had watched me get humiliated, who'd seen me built up just enough to be torn down, who'd witnessed Serena parade around with Eric while I became the office ghost story that people didn't talk about in polite company. They were all clapping. Some of them were even standing, their champagne flutes forgotten on tables and trays, their faces showing expressions that ranged from respect to barely suppressed glee. The buzzcut security guard who tried to escort me out earlier was clapping too, a huge grin on his face. His partner had his hands cupped around his mouth and actually shouted, "Hell yeah," which probably violated about 17 company policies, but who was going to enforce those now? Janet from HR? She was too busy having an existential crisis near the stage. Amanda, the junior developer I'd trained, was clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. Next to her, Marcus, my old college buddy who'd gotten me into this mess in the first place, gave me a salute that was part respect, part apology, and entirely deserved. Even some of the investors were clapping, including the older gentleman who'd threatened to call his broker earlier. He raised his glass to me with a nod that suggested he appreciated a well-executed power play when he saw one, even if it was costing him money. Miguel the bartender was doing the slow clap, the kind you see in movies when someone's about to give an inspiring speech, except this wasn't a movie and there was no speech. Just me, standing in a doorway, watching the people who'd forgotten I existed suddenly remember exactly how much they'd needed me all along. Even the DJ looked impressed, and this was a guy who probably spun at corporate events 3 times a week and thought he'd seen everything. He actually stopped the ambient music he'd been playing, because apparently he'd kept working through the entire system meltdown like the professional he was, and the sudden silence made the applause even more dramatic. His playlist had nothing on my timing, and from the look on his face, he knew it. Eric wasn't clapping. He was standing near the stage with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand, while presumably getting screamed at by another client or investor, or possibly his mother, who would definitely be disappointed in how this evening had turned out. Serena wasn't clapping either. She'd sunk into one of those ridiculously expensive chairs they'd rented for the event, her silver dress pooling around her like liquid mercury, her face buried in her hands in a pose that would have made a great album cover for a country song about regret and poor life choices. Tyler and the tech team weren't clapping because they were too busy frantically typing on their laptops, probably trying to find some miraculous workaround that didn't exist, but a few of them looked up long enough to give me nods of acknowledgement. Sarah actually stopped what she was doing to give me a full standing ovation, and I appreciated that. She'd always been one of the good ones, someone who understood that systems were built by people, not manifested out of thin air by CEO charisma and quarterly earnings reports. I gave the room a small bow, nothing too dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that yes, I was aware of the applause, and yes, I was absolutely savoring every second of it. Then I pushed through those doors and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and the sound of 300 people who just learned a very valuable lesson about reading contracts and treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources. Outside, the night air felt different. Lighter. Honest. The kind of air that doesn't lie to you about late-night meetings or team dinners or business trips to San Francisco. The October breeze carried the smell of the city, exhaust fumes, street food from the vendors that set up on the corner, that indefinable scent that big cities have that's somehow both grimy and alive. And it was infinitely more appealing than the expensive catering and fake politeness I'd just left behind. The valet parking attendant, a young guy who probably made minimum wage to stand outside in the cold and fetch cars for people who thought tipping was optional, watched me emerge from the gala with wide eyes. Sir? Do you need your car?" he asked hesitantly, probably wondering if I was about to cause a scene in his section of the world too. "Yeah," I said, handing him my ticket. "And you might want to stay out here for the next hour or so. It's about to get real messy in there." He glanced at the glass doors, through which you could still see the chaos unfolding in the ballroom, and nodded slowly. "Worse than it already is?" "So much worse," I confirmed, and slipped him a 20 because he'd been polite and seemed like a decent kid who deserved a heads up about the exodus that was probably going to happen when people started fleeing this disaster like rats from a sinking ship. My phone, which I'd silenced during the festivities because I'd wanted to enjoy the show without distractions, suddenly started buzzing like it was having a seizure. Notifications poured in so fast the screen couldn't keep up. Texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, even a couple of voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and started scrolling through the chaos. Job offers. Holy shit, the job offers. At least 10 of them already. From companies ranging from startups to massive tech corporations. All of them apparently having heard through the industry grapevine about what had just gone down at the Grandview Hotel. News traveled fast in Silicon Valley, and news about a developer taking down an entire company by revoking his own access traveled at light speed. Saw what happened at Nexus. Very interested in discussing opportunities. Name your price. That was from TechCore, a company I'd interviewed with last year before deciding to go with Nexus because Serena had been so excited about us working in the same building. We need someone who actually understands system security. Are you available? DataBridge Industries, offering a six-figure salary right there in the text message like they were afraid someone else would snap me up first. Partnership deals, consulting offers, even a message from a venture capitalist who wanted to fund whatever I wanted to build next, because apparently publicly destroying your former employer's infrastructure was the new way to prove you were worth investing in. The tech industry was weird, but I wasn't complaining. And then, buried in the avalanche of professional opportunities and congratulations from people I barely knew, there was one text from Serena. Just 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment, standing there on the sidewalk while the valet went to get my car, the sounds of the city humming around me like a soundtrack to my newfound freedom. We need to talk. The classic phrase of someone who'd realized they'd screwed up, but wasn't quite ready to admit it out loud. The opening line of a conversation that would probably involve apologies and excuses and justifications for why she'd done what she'd done, all wrapped up in the kind of emotional manipulation that people use when they want you to forget they'd stabbed you in the back. I could have responded with a lot of things. I could have written a long message about trust and betrayal and how she'd taken the foundation we built together and used it to elevate herself while pushing me down. I could have told her exactly how many nights I'd spent lying awake wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently, how I could have been better, before finally realizing that none of it was my fault and all of it was her choice. Instead, I opened my photos, found the screenshot I'd taken earlier of those massive screens displaying their error message, and sent it to her without any commentary. Just the image, primary key missing, rendered in that cold, clinical font against a black background. Some metaphors write themselves, and this one didn't need any explanation. The backup was nothing without the original. The system didn't work without its creator. The foundation crumbles when you remove the person who built it, and then act surprised when everything falls apart. 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing a response. Then they disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared again. Whatever she was trying to say, she couldn't find the words. And honestly, that was probably the most honest communication we'd had in months. My car arrived, the valet hopping out and holding the door open with a knowing smile that suggested he'd figured out I was somehow responsible for whatever disaster was unfolding inside. I tipped him another 20, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look at the Grandview Hotel, at the glass doors and marble facade, and all that expensive architecture that housed expensive people having expensive problems. Then I drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of their success story and the ruins of my marriage, heading toward whatever came next with a phone full of opportunities and a heart that was finally starting to feel lighter than it had in months. Exit, stage left. The show was over, and I'd gotten my standing ovation. As I reached those massive glass doors, something unexpected happened. Something that I definitely hadn't planned for, but was going to replay in my head for years to come like the world's most satisfying movie scene. Applause broke out behind me. Actual, genuine, sustained applause that started somewhere near the back of the ballroom and rippled forward like a wave, building in volume until it filled the entire space with the kind of sound usually reserved for rock concerts and standing ovations. Not for Eric. Not for Serena. Not for the company that was currently experiencing a meltdown of biblical proportions. For me. For the guy who'd been escorted out of meetings, dismissed as background noise, and treated like his contributions were as forgettable as yesterday's weather forecast. I stopped with my hand on the door handle, turned around, and just soaked it in. 300 employees who had watched me get humiliated, who'd seen me built up just enough to be torn down, who'd witnessed Serena parade around with Eric while I became the office ghost story that people didn't talk about in polite company. They were all clapping. Some of them were even standing, their champagne flutes forgotten on tables and trays, their faces showing expressions that ranged from respect to barely suppressed glee. The buzzcut security guard who'd tried to escort me out earlier was clapping too, a huge grin on his face. His partner had his hands cupped around his mouth and actually shouted, "Hell yeah," which probably violated about 17 company policies, but who was going to enforce those now? Janet from HR? She was too busy having an existential crisis near the stage. Amanda, the junior developer I trained, was clapping so hard her hands had to hurt. Next to her, Marcus, my old college buddy who'd gotten me into this mess in the first place, gave me a salute that was part respect, part apology, and entirely deserved. Even some of the investors were clapping, including the older gentleman who'd threatened to call his broker earlier. He raised his glass to me with a nod that suggested he appreciated a well-executed power play when he saw one, even if it was costing him money. Miguel the bartender was doing the slow clap, the kind you see in movies when someone's about to give an inspiring speech, except this wasn't a movie and there was no speech. Just me, standing in a doorway, watching the people who'd forgotten I existed suddenly remember exactly how much they'd needed me all along. Even the DJ looked impressed, and this was a guy who probably spun at corporate events 3 times a week and thought he'd seen everything. He actually stopped the ambient music he'd been playing, because apparently he'd kept working through the entire system meltdown like the professional he was, and the sudden silence made the applause even more dramatic. His playlist had nothing on my timing, and from the look on his face, he knew it. Eric wasn't clapping. He was standing near the stage with his phone pressed to his ear, gesturing wildly with his free hand, while presumably getting screamed at by another client or investor, or possibly his mother, who would definitely be disappointed in how this evening had turned out. Serena wasn't clapping either. She'd sunk into one of those ridiculously expensive chairs they'd rented for the event, her silver dress pooling around her like liquid mercury, her face buried in her hands in a pose that would have made a great album cover for a country song about regret and poor life choices. Tyler and the tech team weren't clapping because they were too busy frantically typing on their laptops, probably trying to find some miraculous workaround that didn't exist, but a few of them looked up long enough to give me nods of acknowledgement. Sarah actually stopped what she was doing to give me a full standing ovation, and I appreciated that. She'd always been one of the good ones, someone who understood that systems were built by people, not manifested out of thin air by CEO charisma and quarterly earnings reports. I gave the room a small bow, nothing too dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that yes, I was aware of the applause, and yes, I was absolutely savoring every second of it. Then I pushed through those doors and stepped out into the night, leaving behind the crystal chandeliers and marble floors and the sound of 300 people who just learned a very valuable lesson about reading contracts and treating people like human beings instead of disposable resources. Outside, the night air felt different. Lighter. Honest. The kind of air that doesn't lie to you about late-night meetings or team dinners or business trips to San Francisco. The October breeze carried the smell of the city, exhaust fumes, street food from the vendors that set up on the corner, that indefinable scent that big cities have that's somehow both grimy and alive. And it was infinitely more appealing than the expensive catering and fake politeness I'd just left behind. The valet parking attendant, a young guy who probably made minimum wage to stand outside in the cold and fetch cars for people who thought tipping was optional, watched me emerge from the gala with wide eyes. Sir? Do you need your car?" he asked hesitantly, probably wondering if I was about to cause a scene in his section of the world too. "Yeah," I said, handing him my ticket. "And you might want to stay out here for the next hour or so. It's about to get real messy in there." He glanced at the glass doors, through which you could still see the chaos unfolding in the ballroom, and nodded slowly. "Worse than it already is?" "So much worse," I confirmed, and slipped him a 20 because he'd been polite and seemed like a decent kid who deserved a heads up about the exodus that was probably going to happen when people started fleeing this disaster like rats from a sinking ship. My phone, which I'd silenced during the festivities because I'd wanted to enjoy the show without distractions, suddenly started buzzing like it was having a seizure. Notifications poured in so fast the screen couldn't keep up. Texts, emails, LinkedIn messages, even a couple of voicemails from numbers I didn't recognize. I pulled it out and started scrolling through the chaos. Job offers. Holy shit, the job offers. At least 10 of them already. From companies ranging from startups to massive tech corporations. All of them apparently having heard through the industry grapevine about what had just gone down at the Grandview Hotel. News traveled fast in Silicon Valley, and news about a developer taking down an entire company by revoking his own access traveled at light speed. Saw what happened at Nexus. Very interested in discussing opportunities. Name your price. That was from TechCore, a company I'd interviewed with last year before deciding to go with Nexus because Serena had been so excited about us working in the same building. We need someone who actually understands system security. Are you available? DataBridge Industries, offering a six-figure salary right there in the text message like they were afraid someone else would snap me up first. Partnership deals, consulting offers, even a message from a venture capitalist who wanted to fund whatever I wanted to build next, because apparently publicly destroying your former employer's infrastructure was the new way to prove you were worth investing in. The tech industry was weird, but I wasn't complaining. And then, buried in the avalanche of professional opportunities and congratulations from people I barely knew, there was one text from Serena. Just 4 words. We need to talk. I stared at it for a long moment, standing there on the sidewalk while the valet went to get my car, the sounds of the city humming around me like a soundtrack to my newfound freedom. We need to talk. The classic phrase of someone who'd realized they'd screwed up, but wasn't quite ready to admit it out loud. The opening line of a conversation that would probably involve apologies and excuses and justifications for why she'd done what she'd done, all wrapped up in the kind of emotional manipulation that people use when they want you to forget they'd stabbed you in the back. I could have responded with a lot of things. I could have written a long message about trust and betrayal and how she'd taken the foundation we built together and used it to elevate herself while pushing me down. I could have told her exactly how many nights I'd spent lying awake wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have done differently, how I could have been better, before finally realizing that none of it was my fault and all of it was her choice. Instead, I opened my photos, found the screenshot I'd taken earlier of those massive screens displaying their error message, and sent it to her without any commentary. Just the image, primary key missing, rendered in that cold, clinical font against a black background. Some metaphors write themselves, and this one didn't need any explanation. The backup was nothing without the original. The system didn't work without its creator. The foundation crumbles when you remove the person who built it, and then act surprised when everything falls apart. 3 dots appeared immediately, showing she was typing a response. Then they disappeared, then appeared again, then disappeared again. Whatever she was trying to say, she couldn't find the words, and honestly that was probably the most honest communication we'd had in months. My car arrived, the valet hopping out and holding the door open with a knowing smile that suggested he'd figured out I was somehow responsible for whatever disaster was unfolding inside. I tipped him another 20, slid into the driver's seat, and took one last look at the Grandview Hotel, at the glass doors and marble facade, and all that expensive architecture that housed expensive people having expensive problems. Then I drove away, leaving behind the wreckage of their success story and the ruins of my marriage, heading toward whatever came next with a phone full of opportunities and a heart that was finally starting to feel lighter than it had in months. Exit, stage left. The show was over, and I'd gotten my standing ovation. By the next morning, every financial paper, tech blog, and business news outlet was screaming the same headline with slightly different variations of corporate panic. Langford Industries crashes, internal sabotage suspected. Tech giant Nexus Data Labs experiences catastrophic system failure. CEO Eric Langford under investigation following anniversary gala disaster. My personal favorite was from TechCrunch. When your infrastructure walks out, the cautionary tale of Nexus Data Labs. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I'd bought from IKEA 3 years ago when Serena and I first moved in together, and I'd spent 4 hours assembling it wrong before starting over, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of orange and gold while my coffee maker gurgled its morning symphony. My apartment felt different now, not emptier exactly, but cleaner somehow, like I'd finally opened all the windows and let the stale air out. The photos of Serena still sat on the shelf, but they looked like artifacts from someone else's life, memories belonging to a version of me that no longer existed. I poured myself a cup of coffee, dark and bitter the way I liked it now instead of the sugary caramel monstrosity Serena used to make fun of me for ordering at Starbucks, and turned on the news. CNN had already picked up the story, running it as their business segment with one of those serious-faced anchors who probably didn't understand half the technical terms she was reading off the teleprompter but was doing her best to look concerned about it. Sources say the company's entire digital infrastructure went offline during what was supposed to be a celebration of their 5th anniversary. The anchor reported, her expression suggesting this was somehow both tragic and mildly scandalous. Multiple clients have already filed complaints with regulatory agencies, and stock prices have plummeted nearly 40% since markets opened this morning. Representatives from Nexus Data Labs were not available for comment, but an internal email leaked to our producers suggests the company is currently unable to access its own systems. I smiled into my coffee mug. Unable to access its own systems. That was one way to put it. Another way would be locked out of the house they thought they owned because they forgot the guy with the keys wasn't actually optional. But corporate speak was never good at admitting fault in clear terms. My phone rang. The display showing Leo's name and his contact photo that was still a picture from our college days when we both had significantly more hair and significantly less understanding of how the real world worked. I answered on the second ring, already grinning because I knew exactly what this call was going to be about. Man, you really logged them out of reality. Leo's voice came through the speaker, loud and delighted and absolutely loving every second of this drama. He'd been my best friend since freshman year when we'd bonded over debugging code at 3 a.m. and arguing about whether tabs or spaces were superior for indentation. I saw the news this morning and I literally spit out my cereal. That was you, wasn't it? Tell me that was you. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, keeping my voice innocently neutral. I just attended a party I wasn't invited to. Whatever happened after that was purely coincidental. Bullshit, Leo laughed. Purely coincidental, my ass. Dude, you're a legend. The entire tech community is talking about this. There are memes already. Someone made a GIF of that primary key missing error message with the caption, "When you forget who built your empire." It's got like 50,000 shares. Really? I pulled up Twitter on my laptop, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, and sure enough, hashtag primary key missing was trending nationally. People were applying it to everything from bad relationships to forgetting passwords to that existential feeling when you realize you've lost something important but can't remember what. It had transcended the original context and become a cultural moment, which was both hilarious and slightly surreal. Guess they should have read the terms and conditions, I said, echoing what I'd told Leo last night when he'd called at midnight, having heard through the grapevine that something massive was going down at the Grandview Hotel. Leo was quiet for a second, then his voice softened slightly, losing some of the excitement and gaining something more sincere. But seriously, how are you doing? I know this whole thing with Serena has been rough. I looked around my apartment, at the space that was slowly becoming just mine again instead of ours. Honestly, better than I've been in months. It's weird, but watching everything fall apart last night felt like closure. Like the universe finally caught up to the scoreboard and realized they'd been crediting the wrong player for all the points. That's deep, man. Very philosophical. Very logged out of toxic relationships and into personal growth. Shut up. I laughed, but it was genuine laughter, the kind I hadn't experienced in a while. The kind that came from actually finding something funny instead of just going through the motions of seeming happy. After I hung up with Leo, I spent the next hour doing something I probably should have done months ago. I went through my phone, my laptop, my cloud storage, and I started deleting photos of Serena and me at company events where she smiled at the camera while mentally calculating her next career move. Screenshots of sweet text messages that turned out to be lies wrapped in emojis. The folder labeled Us that contained 3 years of memories that now felt like evidence in a case I'd already won. Delete, delete, delete. Each one felt like dropping weight I'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had gotten. Somewhere in that glass tower downtown, in offices that were probably in full crisis mode with emergency meetings and lawyers and PR specialists trying to spin this disaster into something manageable, Serena was realizing something I'd known for months. The difference between power and ownership. She'd had power, the influence, the reputation, the corner office with the nice view. But I'd had ownership, the foundation, the infrastructure, the actual substance that made everything else possible. The backup was nothing without the original. Not just for computer systems, but for relationships, for careers, for any success story built on someone else's work. You can't just extract the value from someone, discard them, and expect everything to keep functioning like they never mattered. Eventually, the system recognizes its creator and refuses to work for anyone else. My phone buzzed again. Another job offer. This one from a startup offering equity and creative control and the kind of respect I should have demanded from the beginning. I added it to the list I'd started last night, a spreadsheet of opportunities that was growing faster than I could review them. Funny how quickly your value becomes apparent when people realize they can't just take it for granted anymore. I deleted another photo. This one from our wedding, both of us smiling like we believed in forever and felt nothing but relief. That version of me, the one who thought love meant sacrifice and compromise and accepting less than I deserved, had been successfully uninstalled. Time for the upgrade. I opened a new document on my laptop, titled it, "What's Next?" and started making plans. Not revenge plans this time, but actual future plans. Projects I wanted to build, companies I wanted to work with, maybe even starting my own thing where I wouldn't have to worry about someone else taking credit for my code. Life 2.0 was downloading, and this version came with better security protocols, stronger boundaries, and a much clearer understanding of my own worth. Outside my window, the city was waking up, going about its business, completely unaware that somewhere in a corporate boardroom, powerful people were learning a very expensive lesson about reading contracts and treating people with basic human decency. The sun was shining, my coffee was still hot, and for the first time in a very long time, I had absolutely no idea what came next. And that uncertainty felt a lot like freedom. My wife said, "My ex-lover is joining US for Christmas dinner. Be mature about it." I nodded, of course. What she didn't know was that I invited her ex's fiancé too. The dinner table turned into a scene nobody in my family will ever forget. Look, I'm gonna be real with you right from the jump. I'm not some hero in this story. I'm just a regular dude who thought he had life figured out, you know? I had a decent job that didn't make me want to throw myself into traffic every Monday morning, a wife who I genuinely loved, spoiler alert, hold that thought, and a solid collection of vinyl records that I'd been building since college because apparently I'm pretentious like that. Wednesday nights were my favorite because that's when I'd cook dinner. Nothing fancy, just good old-fashioned comfort food that reminded me I was an actual functioning adult and not some overgrown kid eating cereal for every meal like I did in my early 20s. So there I was, standing in our kitchen that we'd renovated last spring after watching way too many HGTV shows, stirring a pot of spaghetti like some kind of domestic god. The pasta was doing that thing where it's perfectly al dente. The sauce was bubbling away with just the right amount of garlic. Because let's be honest, there's no such thing as too much garlic. And Mariah Carey was belting out, "All I Want for Christmas Is You" from the speaker on the counter. I was humming along, completely off-key, but not giving a single damn because nobody was judging me. Or so I thought. The kitchen smelled incredible, like basil and tomatoes and those Italian dreams you have after watching too many Sopranos episodes. I was in my zone, my safe space, my little bubble of, hey, maybe adulthood isn't the absolute dumpster fire everyone said it would be. Lydia was sitting at the kitchen table, phone in hand, scrolling with the kind of intensity that suggested she was either reading something deeply important or stalking her high school friends to see who got fat. Her blonde hair was pulled back in one of those messy buns that somehow looked effortlessly perfect, and she was wearing my old college sweatshirt that she'd basically stolen from my closet 3 years ago and never returned. We'd been married for 5 years at this point, together for 7, and I thought we were solid. Like, gonna grow old together and argue about thermostat settings, kind of solid. Sure, we had our moments, every couple does, but nothing that made me think our relationship was circling the drain or anything. Then she dropped the bomb, just casually, like she was commenting on the weather or asking me to pick up milk on the way home. So, my ex-lover, Adrian, is joining us for Christmas dinner. Be mature about it. I'm gonna need you to understand something here. Time literally stopped. Like, I'm talking full-on movie moment where everything goes into slow motion and you can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. The wooden spoon I was holding froze mid-stir, and I swear the spaghetti noodles were clinging to it like they knew something terrible had just happened, and they were holding on for dear life. Mariah was still singing about Christmas, completely oblivious to the fact that my world was currently imploding in a suburban kitchen that still had a mortgage. I turned around slowly, probably looking like some kind of confused owl, and I just stared at her. She wasn't even looking up from her phone, just sitting there, scrolling away, like she'd just told me she was thinking about getting bangs or something equally mundane. My brain was doing that thing where it tries to process information, but all the circuits are firing wrong, like when you accidentally put aluminum foil in the microwave and everything just starts sparking and making weird noises. I'm sorry, I said, my voice coming out way calmer than I felt inside. Could you repeat that? Because I think I just had a minor stroke and my ears stopped working properly. She looked up then, gave me this little smile that I'd usually find cute, but in that moment made me want to launch myself into the sun, and repeated it. Word for word. Adrian is joining us for Christmas dinner. My ex. I invited him. Be mature about it. There it was again. Be mature about it. Like she was asking me to be cool about her choosing a different Netflix show or something. Not inviting the dude she used to bang to my parents' house for the most important family dinner of the year. I stood there, sauce starting to burn on the stove because I'd completely forgotten about it, trying to figure out if this was real life or if I'd somehow fallen into an alternate dimension where spouses just casually invited their exes to family gatherings and expected their partners to throw confetti and celebrate. Why? I finally managed to ask, turning down the heat on the stove before I burned down the house we were still paying for. Why on God's green earth would you invite your ex-boyfriend to Christmas dinner? At my parents' house? Where my entire family will be. Lydia put her phone down. First time in 20 minutes, by the way, and gave me this look that was probably supposed to be sympathetic but came across more like I was a child who didn't understand basic arithmetic. He's going through a really tough time right now, Derek. He's lonely. He doesn't have family nearby, and I thought it would be nice to include him. It's the season of giving and goodwill toward men and all that, right? Oh, absolutely. The season of goodwill. How could I forget? Let's just invite every ex-boyfriend, ex-girlfriend, and random person we've ever hooked up with to family dinner, because Jesus said to love thy neighbor, or whatever. Maybe we should invite her orthodontist from middle school too. Really make it a party. I took a deep breath, counted to 5 in my head like my therapist taught me during those anger management sessions I took after the incident with my boss. Long story, different disaster, and tried to approach this rationally. Lydia, honey, sweetheart, love of my life. Christmas dinner is at my parents' house. It's a family thing. You can't just invite random people, especially not people you used to sleep with. He's not random. She shot back, getting that defensive tone that usually meant this conversation was about to go sideways fast. We were together for 3 years. He's important to me, and it's not like I'm still in love with him or anything. I just want to help a friend out during the holidays. A friend? Sure. Because everyone stays super close friends with their exes and thinks about them enough to invite them to intimate family gatherings. That's totally normal and not at all a giant red flag the size of Texas. Here's where it got really good, though. I asked her the obvious question. Did you at least ask my mom if this was okay? Since it's, her house and her dinner that she's been planning for 2 months? Lydia smiled. Actually smiled. Like she'd just won some kind of prize. I did actually. I called her this morning. She said it was fine and that we should all be more welcoming and charitable during the holidays. And that was the part that absolutely destroyed me. Not the fact that she'd invited Adrian. Not even the sheer audacity of thinking this was remotely appropriate. No, what really twisted the knife was that she'd gone behind my back, called my own mother, and gotten approval before even mentioning it to me. My own mom had conspired against me. The woman who gave birth to me, raised me, kissed my scraped knees, and taught me how to ride a bike had sided with my wife on the absolutely insane decision to invite her ex-lover to our family Christmas dinner. I stood there in that kitchen, sauce now definitely burning despite my best efforts, Mariah Carey mocking me with her joy and cheer, and I realized something important. I was married to someone who thought this was okay. Someone who valued her ex-boyfriend's feelings over her husband's comfort. Someone who went behind my back to my own mother to get permission for something that should have never even been a question. So I did what any mature, rational adult would do in this situation. I smiled. A big, bright, totally fake smile that probably made me look like a serial killer, but whatever. I turned off the stove, walked over to her, put my hand on her shoulder, and said in the sweetest voice I could muster, "Of course, honey. You're absolutely right. I'll be completely mature about it. Adrian is more than welcome at Christmas dinner." She looked relieved. Actually relieved. Like she'd been worried I might object or cause problems, or, I don't know, act like a normal human being who has boundaries and self-respect. "Thank you," she said, squeezing my hand. "I knew you'd understand. This is why I love you. You're so emotionally evolved." Emotionally evolved. That's what she called it. I nodded. kept smiling, and went back to the stove to salvage what was left of dinner. But inside, the gears were already turning. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about being mature. Sometimes being mature means playing the long game. Sometimes it means smiling and nodding while you're secretly planning the most epic, karma-filled holiday surprise since Scrooge got visited by 3 ghosts. Spoiler alert, I was about to be very, very mature about this whole situation. The most mature I'd ever been in my entire life. So mature that people would write legends about my maturity. Christmas card-worthy maturity. I just needed to do a little research first. So here's the thing about trying to fall asleep when your wife has just casually dropped a nuclear bomb on your marriage. It's basically impossible. I'm talking full-on staring at the ceiling like it's gonna suddenly reveal the meaning of life, or at least explain what the hell just happened in my kitchen 3 hours ago. Lydia was beside me, sleeping like an actual baby, breathing all peaceful and steady like she hadn't just invited her ex-lover to Christmas dinner and completely obliterated my sense of reality. Meanwhile, I was lying there doing mental gymnastics, trying to figure out if I'd somehow slipped into an alternate universe where this kind of behavior was considered normal and acceptable. The bedroom was dark except for the little bit of streetlight creeping through the curtains, and I could hear our neighbor's dog barking at absolutely nothing, because that's what dogs do at midnight. They bark at ghosts or leaves, or their own existential dread, who knows. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, analyzing every word, every facial expression, trying to find the moment where things went sideways. Was it when she called my mom behind my back? Was it when she smiled like she'd done something thoughtful instead of completely insane? Or was it the part where she told me to be mature about it, like I was some kind of toddler who needed a lesson in sharing? Around midnight, after counting approximately 8 million ceiling tiles and contemplating every life choice I'd made since middle school, I gave up on sleep entirely. The curiosity was eating me alive, like some kind of parasite that feeds on your peace of mind and replaces it with paranoia and conspiracy theories. I needed answers. I needed to know what the hell was really going on here, because my gut, that trusty internal alarm system that had saved me from bad decisions more times than I could count, was screaming that something was seriously wrong with this whole situation. I turned my head slightly and looked at Lydia, still sleeping peacefully, her phone sitting right there on the nightstand like a little treasure chest full of secrets. Now, I know what you're thinking. Derek, don't do it, man. That's a violation of privacy. That's crossing a line you can't uncross. And you're absolutely right. Under normal circumstances, I would never, ever go through my wife's phone. I'm not that guy. I believe in trust and respect and all those relationship fundamentals that therapists talk about on podcasts. But here's the thing. These were not normal circumstances. These were my wife invited her ex-boyfriend to Christmas dinner, and I'm pretty sure I'm being gaslit circumstances, which I'm pretty confident fall under the exception clause of the relationship rulebook. So I did it. I reached over, moving as slowly as a sloth on sedatives, because the last thing I needed was for her to wake up and catch me mid-investigation, and I grabbed her phone. My heart was pounding like I was defusing a bomb in an action movie, and my hands were actually shaking a little bit, which was ridiculous because this was my wife, not some stranger. I knew her passcode, 1-2-3-4, because apparently she had the cybersecurity awareness of a potato, and I unlocked that phone faster than you can say trust issues. The screen lit up, temporarily blinding me like I'd just stared directly into the sun, and I quickly turned down the brightness before I woke up the entire neighborhood with my nuclear-powered investigation light. I went straight to her messages, scrolling past the usual stuff, group chats with her work friends complaining about their boss, texts from her sister about some Netflix show, a reminder from her dentist about a cleaning appointment. Normal stuff. Boring stuff. The kind of stuff that makes you feel guilty for snooping because maybe you're just being paranoid and everything is actually fine. Then I found it. The chat with Adrian. And let me tell you, it was like opening Pandora's box, except instead of releasing all the evils into the world, it just released all the confirmation of my worst fears directly into my brain. I started scrolling up, going back through weeks of messages, and holy mother of red flags, it was bad. Like, emotional affair that's definitely headed toward physical territory bad. The messages weren't explicitly sexual or anything. Lydia's too smart for that. She knows how to cover her tracks. But they were intimate in that way that's somehow worse than just hooking up. It was all feelings and memories, and what-if conversations that made my stomach twist into knots. Adrian had written, "I miss what we had. Things were so simple back then, you know? We just got each other." And Lydia, my wife, the woman who promised to forsake all others when we stood at that altar 5 years ago, had responded, "I know. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we tried harder. If we'd been more mature back then. Tried harder. Tried harder. Lady, you can't even open a jar of pickles without calling me into the kitchen like I'm some kind of emergency jar opening service. And you're sitting here wondering what would have happened if you tried harder with your ex?" The audacity. The sheer, unfiltered audacity of this woman was actually impressive in a horrifying sort of way. I kept scrolling, my detective hat firmly in place, and it just got worse. There were messages about how she felt stuck sometimes, how she wondered if she'd settled down too fast, how Adrian really understood her, in ways that apparently I didn't, despite literally living with her and doing her laundry and listening to her complain about her coworkers for 5 straight years. There were inside jokes and references to their past relationship, little heart emojis that made me want to throw the phone across the room, and worst of all, there were messages about Christmas dinner. "Adrian, are you sure your husband's gonna be cool with me being there? Seems kinda weird, no offense." "Lydia, Derek's really mature and understanding. He won't make it weird. Plus, my mother-in-law already said yes, so it's happening. I really want you there." She really wanted him there. Not, "I felt bad for you being alone," or "it seemed like the charitable thing to do." No, she wanted him there. At my parents' house. At our family Christmas dinner. This wasn't about charity or holiday spirit or any of that nonsense she'd sold me earlier. This was about her wanting to see her ex-boyfriend, wanting to have him in her life, wanting to keep that door open for whatever future possibilities her mind was cooking up. My hands were shaking for real now, not from nervousness but from pure, unfiltered rage mixed with heartbreak and a dash of, "I can't believe this is actually happening to me." I was that guy now. The guy whose wife is emotionally cheating. The guy who has to snoop through phones at midnight because his reality has become a Jerry Springer episode. The guy who's getting played in his own marriage. But here's where I surprised myself. Instead of waking her up right then and there, instead of starting a screaming match at 12:30 in the morning that would definitely result in the neighbors calling the cops, I did something way smarter. I took screenshots. Lots of them. Every incriminating message, every flirty exchange, every single piece of evidence that proved this wasn't just about helping out a friend during the holidays. I was moving through that phone like the FBI during a raid, like a caffeinated investigator with a vendetta and a smartphone. Screenshot, screenshot, screenshot. I sent them all to my own phone, watching each message whoosh through the digital universe and land safely in my text messages. Evidence secured. Case building. Revenge brewing. I was half detective, half heartbroken, and half completely done with this nonsense. Yes, that's 3 halves. Math doesn't matter when your life is falling apart. By the time I was done, I had approximately 40 screenshots documenting weeks of emotional infidelity. I carefully placed her phone back on the nightstand, exactly where it had been, screen facing down just like she'd left it. Then I lay back down, staring at that same ceiling, but this time with a completely different mindset. I wasn't sad anymore. Don't get me wrong. Part of me was absolutely devastated. The part that had loved this woman, that had built a life with her, that had imagined growing old together and arguing about which retirement home had the best shuffleboard courts. That part was shattered into about 8 million pieces. But the dominant emotion, the one that was drowning out everything else, was something else entirely. It was strategic. It was calculated. It was the feeling you get when you're about to flip the script on someone who thought they were playing you. I wasn't just going to let this slide. I wasn't going to be mature in the way she expected. You know, the doormat kind of mature where I smile and nod while she parades her ex around my family like some kind of emotional support peacock. No, I was going to be mature in a different way. The kind of mature that involves careful planning, perfect timing, and making absolutely sure that when the truth comes out, it comes out in the most spectacular, karma-filled way possible. Lydia wanted Adrian at Christmas dinner? Fine. He could come. But he wasn't going to be the only surprise guest at that party. Because by morning, I wasn't sad Derek anymore, the confused husband wondering what he did wrong. I was strategic Derek, the man with a plan and 40 screenshots worth of ammunition. Game on. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of purpose usually reserved for people training for marathons or planning military coups. Lydia had already left for work, some early morning meeting that she'd mentioned last week, but that I'd completely tuned out because apparently my subconscious knew she wasn't worth my full attention anymore. I made myself a pot of coffee so strong it could probably strip paint off walls, sat down at my laptop, and became what I can only describe as a digital stalker with a righteous cause. First order of business: figure out who the hell Adrian actually was beyond just Lydia's ex-boyfriend who's apparently having a rough time. Because here's the thing about people who claim they're going through something difficult. 9 times out of 10, they're either lying, exaggerating, or they cause their own problems and want sympathy for it. I had a feeling Adrian fell into at least 2 of those categories, possibly all 3 if I was lucky. I started with the basics. Facebook, because apparently people still use that dinosaur of a social media platform to document their entire lives for their aunt's friends to comment on. I typed in Adrian, plus the last name I remembered Lydia mentioning once or twice in the early days of our relationship, when she was still being honest about her past. Adrian Kershaw sounded like a name that belonged to either a British poet or a guy who wears too much cologne and calls women females. I was betting on the latter. His Facebook profile popped up immediately because the dude had his privacy settings looser than a gas station hot dog that's been sitting under the heat lamp since Tuesday. And what do you know? His relationship status was right there at the top of his page, bold as day. Engaged to Clara Mills. Engaged. Engaged. This man was engaged to be married, and he was out here texting my wife about missing what they had and wondering what could have been. The rough time he was supposedly going through wasn't some tragic loss or career setback or health crisis. No, the rough time was probably just the normal stress of wedding planning mixed with the fact that he was apparently a dirtbag who couldn't let go of his ex-girlfriend even though he was literally promising to spend the rest of his life with someone else. I sat back in my chair, took a long sip of my nuclear coffee, and let this information sink in. Adrian wasn't some lonely, pathetic guy who needed the warmth of human connection during the holidays. He was an engaged man who was emotionally cheating on his fiancée, while my wife emotionally cheated on me with him. It was like a cheating inception, a betrayal turducken. And somehow, neither of them thought this was a problem worth mentioning. But wait, it gets better. I clicked on Clara's profile next, because if I was going down this rabbit hole, I was going all the way to Wonderland. Her page was exactly what you'd expect from someone who probably had no idea her fiancé was a walking red flag factory. Her profile picture showed a woman with kind eyes, a genuine smile, and the kind of wholesome energy that made you think she probably volunteered at animal shelters on weekends and sent birthday cards to her grandmother. She looked way too nice to be caught up in this absolute dumpster fire of a situation. I scrolled through her photos, pictures of her and Adrian at various events, looking happy and couple Y, doing that thing where they both tilt their heads the same direction for photos like they practiced it in a mirror. There were engagement pictures from what looked like 3 months ago, taken at some park with fall leaves and golden hour lighting, the kind of photos you'd see in a wedding magazine. Clara was holding up her hand showing off the ring. Adrian was kissing her cheek, and the caption said something about "can't wait to marry my best friend," with approximately 40 heart emojis. Her Instagram was even more wholesome. Lots of inspirational quotes about love and trust, pictures of coffee cups and sunsets, a few workout selfies with captions about self-care and personal growth. There were posts about wedding planning, asking her followers for advice on centerpieces and whether she should do a live band or a DJ. This woman was actively planning her wedding to a man who was simultaneously planning to spend Christmas dinner with his ex-girlfriend at her husband's parents' house. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it at said Christmas dinner. I felt something I didn't expect in that moment. Genuine sympathy for Clara. She was over here, living her life, planning her wedding, posting about table settings and dress fittings, completely oblivious to the fact that her fiancé was a lying scumbag. She didn't deserve this. She didn't deserve to be the other woman who didn't even know she was the other woman. And honestly, she deserved to know the truth just as much as I deserved to blow this whole thing wide open. So I did something that was either absolutely brilliant or completely insane, depending on how you look at it. I created a burner Instagram account. Not with my name. Obviously, I'm not an idiot. I called it Holiday Concern Guy, because subtlety is important when you're about to drop a truth bomb on a stranger's life. I used some random stock photo of a Christmas tree as the profile picture, wrote a bio that said, "Just trying to spread truth this holiday season." And then I sat there for about 10 minutes crafting the perfect message. It needed to be informative, but not aggressive. Honest, but not cruel. The kind of message that would make her pay attention without making her think I was some crazy stalker who got off on ruining people's holidays. After about 7 drafts, I finally settled on this. "Hey Clara, I know this is going to sound weird, and I'm sorry to message you out of the blue, but I thought you should know something. Your fiancé's ex-girlfriend invited him to Christmas dinner at her husband's parents' house. That husband is me. His name is Derek, and I only found out about this a couple days ago. Adrian told my wife he was going through a rough time, and she felt bad for him. I'm guessing he didn't tell you about this dinner? Anyway, I thought you deserved to know. Merry Christmas, and I'm really sorry you got dragged into this mess." I read it over about 15 times, checking for typos and making sure it hit the right tone. Then, before I could chicken out or overthink it even more, I hit send. The message whooshed away into the digital void, and I sat there staring at my screen like I was waiting for test results from a doctor. For about 45 minutes, nothing happened. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe I'd crossed a line or if Clara would just block me and write me off as some weirdo. I made another pot of coffee, less nuclear this time because my hands were already shaking from caffeine and adrenaline, and tried to distract myself by pretending to work on some reports I was supposed to finish by Friday. Then my phone buzzed. Instagram notification. Clara had responded. My heart actually skipped a beat. I'm not being dramatic. I felt that thing do a little stuttery jump in my chest like it forgot how to work for a second. I opened the message, and what I saw made me want to simultaneously high-five myself and pour one out for this poor woman. "Are you serious right now?" Adrian told me he had a work party that night. A work party. He said it was mandatory and that he'd probably be out late because his boss was hosting it at his house. I thought it was weird that a work party was on Christmas, but he said his boss was Jewish, so it wasn't a big deal for them. Oh my God. Oh my God. I can't believe this. There it was. The confirmation I needed. Adrian had straight up lied to his fiancée about where he was going to be on Christmas. Not just a little white lie, but a fully constructed, detailed fabrication complete with a fake Jewish boss and everything. The audacity of this man was actually impressive in the worst possible way. I wrote back immediately. I'm dead serious. I have screenshots of the messages between him and my wife if you want to see them. They're not sexual or anything, but they're definitely inappropriate. Lots of "I miss you," and "what if we tried harder" type stuff. I'm really sorry you're finding out this way. Her response came back in under 2 minutes. Yes. Send them. Please. I need to see everything. So I did. I sent her every single screenshot I'd taken the night before, each one a little nail in Adrian's coffin. I watched the read, receipt pop up and then disappear as she went through them, and I could only imagine what was going through her head. The betrayal, the anger, the feeling of being made a fool of by someone you trusted. We ended up messaging back and forth for about 30 minutes. Clara told me she'd been with Adrian for 2 years, engaged for 3 months, and planning a wedding for next October. She said she'd had some weird feelings about him lately. He'd been distant, on his phone a lot, making excuses to go out alone. But she'd written it off as wedding stress or work pressure. She never imagined he was still hung up on his ex. I told her about Lydia, about how she'd invited him behind my back, about how my own mother had approved it without talking to me first. We bonded over our shared experience of being with people who apparently didn't respect us enough to be honest. It was like the saddest support group ever, except it was just 2 strangers messaging on Instagram about their terrible significant others. Then Clara said something that made me grin like the Grinch planning to steal Christmas. You know what? If you're serious about all this, if this dinner is really happening, I want to come. I stared at that message for a solid 10 seconds, my brain doing calculations about how absolutely nuclear this could go. Then I wrote back. Are you sure? It's going to be messy. Like, potentially explosive. My whole family will be there. Her response was immediate. I'm sure. Adrian wants to play games? Let's play. Besides, I deserve to see the look on his face when he realizes he's been caught. I couldn't argue with that logic. In fact, I loved that logic. I loved it so much I wanted to frame it and hang it on my wall. So I told her, please do come. Bring wine. You're definitely going to need it. I'll text you the address and time. We exchanged actual phone numbers after that, moving the conversation off Instagram because at some point you have to upgrade from burner account messages to real communication. Clara seemed like a genuinely good person who'd been dealt a garbage hand by a garbage human. And me? I was starting to feel like maybe I wasn't the only victim here. Maybe this was bigger than just my marriage falling apart. Maybe this was about holding people accountable for their actions and making sure that lies don't get to masquerade as truth during what's supposed to be the most wonderful time of the year. Christmas dinner was going to be one for the books. The week leading up to Christmas was possibly the most surreal experience of my entire life, and I once accidentally walked into the women's bathroom at a movie theater and didn't realize it until I was washing my hands next to someone applying lipstick, so that's saying something. I had to live with Lydia, sleep next to her, have normal married people conversations with her, all while knowing that I was sitting on information that was going to detonate like a nuclear warhead at Christmas dinner. It was like being an undercover agent in my own house, except instead of gathering intelligence on foreign threats, I was just trying not to burst out laughing every time she mentioned how nice it was that Adrian could join us. Lydia was in full holiday mode, which apparently meant transforming our house into something that looked like a Christmas store had exploded inside it. There were decorations everywhere. Garland on the staircase, lights around every window, a tree so big I'm pretty sure it violated some kind of building code. She spent her evenings baking cookies that filled the house with the smell of cinnamon and sugar, humming along to Christmas carols like she was auditioning for a Hallmark movie. She even broke out the fancy apron her grandmother had given her, the one with little reindeer on it that she only wore when she was feeling particularly domestic. The whole thing would have been adorable if it wasn't completely nauseating given the circumstances. She was playing house, pretending everything was perfect, living in this fantasy world where inviting your ex-boyfriend to your husband's family Christmas dinner was just a normal, charitable act of holiday kindness. Meanwhile, I was walking around with screenshots on my phone and a secret alliance with said ex-boyfriend's fiancé, counting down the days until the whole charade came crashing down like a gingerbread house in an earthquake. The really challenging part was keeping my cool. Every time Lydia mentioned Adrian, which was approximately 47 times a day, I had to bite my tongue so hard I'm surprised I didn't draw blood. She'd say things like, I wonder if Adrian likes pecan pie or pumpkin pie better, or I hope Adrian doesn't feel awkward being around your family, or my personal favorite. It's so sweet that you're being so mature about this whole thing. That last one almost broke me. I had to leave the room and go stand in the garage for 5 minutes, taking deep breaths and reminding myself that revenge is a dish best served cold, preferably on Christmas with a side of public humiliation. I checked in with Clara almost daily, making sure she was still on board with the plan and hadn't backed out or decided this was all too crazy. But honestly, the more we talked, the more I realized she was just as invested in this as I was. She'd done her own digging after our initial conversation and had found even more evidence of Adrian's shoddiness. Apparently, he'd been staying late at work a lot recently, which Clara now realized were probably the nights he was texting Lydia. He'd also been weirdly protective of his phone, taking it with him everywhere, even to the bathroom. Classic cheater behavior, the kind of stuff they probably teach in Infidelity 101. Clara sent me updates throughout the week, mostly just messages saying things like still can't believe this is happening, or found another lie. He said he was with his brother last Tuesday, but his brother was out of town. We were like two detectives comparing notes, except instead of solving a murder, we were just uncovering the fact that our significant others were terrible people. She told me she'd already picked out her outfit for Christmas dinner, a red sweater that she'd originally bought to wear to Adrian's office party, which was deliciously ironic. She was turning his lie into her power move, and I respected that immensely. The hardest part was dealing with my mom. She called me 3 times that week to talk about Christmas dinner preparations, and every single time she brought up Adrian like he was some kind of honored guest we should all be excited to meet. Lydia tells me Adrian is such a nice young man, she said during one call, and I had to grip my phone so tight I nearly cracked the screen. It's very charitable of you both to include him during the holidays. Your father and I raised you right. Oh, Mom. Sweet, naive mom who thought her son was being mature and charitable when really her son was orchestrating the most dramatic dinner party since the Last Supper. I wanted to tell her everything, to warn her that Christmas was going to be less Silent Night and more explosive night, but I kept my mouth shut. The surprise needed to be complete. Everyone needed to see this unfold in real time, without warning, without the ability to prepare or make excuses or try to smooth things over before the truth came out. My sister Jade called me too, mostly to complain about having to wrangle her twin boys for a formal dinner, but she also mentioned Adrian. Mom says you're bringing Lydia's ex to Christmas? That's weird, right? Or am I being judgmental? I told her she wasn't being judgmental, that it was definitely weird, but that I was trying to be the bigger person. She laughed and said, "You're a better man than Dad would have been. He would have lost his mind." Little did she know that I had absolutely lost my mind. I'd just lost it in a very calculated, strategic direction. At work, I was basically useless. I'd sit at my desk, staring at spreadsheets that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the attention I was paying them. My coworker Brad asked me if I was feeling okay, because apparently I'd been smiling to myself randomly throughout the day like some kind of creep. I told him I was just excited for Christmas, which wasn't technically a lie. I was extremely excited for Christmas, just not for the reasons he thought. Every night, I'd come home to Lydia being aggressively cheerful and domestic. She'd greet me at the door with a kiss on the cheek, ask about my day, serve dinner that she'd actually cooked instead of ordering takeout like we usually did. It was like she was overcompensating, trying extra hard to be the perfect wife, probably because some part of her guilty conscience was screaming at her that she was doing something wrong. But she'd push that feeling down, rationalize it away, tell herself that she was just being a good person who was helping out a friend. The texts between her and Adrian continued, of course. I checked her phone every night after she fell asleep, watching their messages like they were episodes of the world's worst TV show. They'd talk about Christmas dinner, about how excited they were to see each other, about how nice it would be to catch up in person. Adrian would say things like, "Can't wait to see you," and Lydia would respond with smiley faces and hearts. Not, "I love you," hearts, or anything that explicit. She was still smart enough to maintain plausible deniability, but the kind of hearts that definitely meant more than just friendship. I screenshot everything, building my case like a lawyer preparing for trial. Clara was doing the same thing on her end, documenting every lie Adrian told her about his whereabouts and his plans. We'd compare notes, share our findings, and basically become the world's most depressing pen pals. But there was something empowering about it too, about knowing that we weren't going to be victims here. We were going to be the ones who pulled back the curtain and showed everyone who these people really were. The night before Christmas, Lydia was practically vibrating with excitement. She spent 3 hours getting everything ready for the next day, wrapping last-minute presents, laying out her outfit, making a checklist of things to bring to my parents' house. She was humming, "Have yourself a merry little Christmas," while she worked, completely oblivious to the fact that tomorrow was going to be anything but merry for her. I sat on the couch, watching her buzz around like a festive bee, and I felt this weird mix of emotions. Part of me was sad. This was my wife, someone I'd loved and built a life with, and I was watching that life crumble in real time. But the bigger part of me, the part that was currently winning the internal battle, was absolutely ready for justice. She'd made her choices. She'd lied, gone behind my back, prioritized her ex-boyfriend's feelings over her husband's dignity. And tomorrow, she was going to face the consequences of those choices in front of everyone who mattered. "Are you excited for tomorrow?" she asked me, plopping down on the couch next to me with a glass of wine, her cheeks flushed from running around all evening. I turned to her and smiled. That same smile I'd been perfecting all week. The one that looked genuine but was actually just a mask, covering the chaos underneath. "Absolutely," I said. "I think tomorrow's going to be unforgettable." "You're being so amazing about all this," she said, leaning her head on my shoulder. "Seriously, Derek, not every husband would be this understanding. I'm really lucky to have you." I wrapped my arm around her, still smiling, and said, "Don't mention it. I'm just trying to be mature about the whole thing." Mature. That word again. It had become my mantra, my catchphrase, my inside joke with myself. Every time someone said I was being mature, I wanted to laugh hysterically because they had no idea what kind of mature I was actually being. I wasn't being doormat mature or pushover mature. I was being chess player mature, strategic mature, long game mature, the kind of mature that waits for exactly the right moment to flip the board and watch all the pieces scatter. That night, I barely slept again. Not from anxiety this time, but from anticipation. Tomorrow was Christmas. Tomorrow was showtime. Tomorrow was the day that Adrian and Lydia's little fantasy world came crashing down, and I was going to have a front row seat to the whole thing. Actually, forget front row seat. I was the director, the producer, and the guy selling popcorn in the lobby. Clara texted me at around midnight. Still good for tomorrow? I'm nervous, but ready. I texted back, still good. See you at 2:45. This is going to be legendary. And honestly, I believed it. Because if there's one thing I'd learned over the past week of pretending everything was fine while secretly planning the most dramatic Christmas dinner in the history of awkward family gatherings, it's that being mature doesn't mean being passive. Sometimes being mature means standing up for yourself. Sometimes it means holding people accountable. And sometimes, just sometimes, it means orchestrating the perfect moment of truth with the precision of a Swiss watch and the drama of a soap opera finale. Merry Christmas to me. Christmas morning arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes you believe in divine intervention or at least really good luck. The sky was clear and blue, the sun was shining but not too hot, and there was just enough of a breeze to make it feel like an actual holiday instead of just another day in suburban America where everyone pretends to like each other for the sake of tradition. I woke up around 7, looked over at Lydia still sleeping peacefully like she wasn't about to have the worst Christmas of her entire life, and I felt this surge of energy that I can only describe as pure, unfiltered anticipation mixed with a healthy dose of vindication. We got to my parents' house around noon, our car loaded down with presents and the fancy desserts Lydia had spent all week making. My childhood home looked exactly like it always did during the holidays. Lights strung up along the roof that my dad had definitely complained about hanging, but secretly loved. A wreath on the front door that was slightly crooked because my mom insisted on doing it herself, and the sound of chaos already emanating from inside because apparently my sister's twins had arrived early and were already tearing through the place like tiny, adorable tornadoes. Walking through that front door felt like entering a time capsule. The house smelled like turkey and stuffing and all those carbs that you pretend you're not going to eat too much of, but absolutely will. My mom had outdone herself with the decorations. There were garlands everywhere, candles on every surface that wasn't occupied by food, and a Christmas tree in the living room that was so covered in ornaments you could barely see the actual tree underneath. It was excessive and over the top and absolutely perfect, which pretty much summed up my mom's approach to everything in life. Derek, Lydia, my mom appeared from the kitchen wearing an apron that said Santa's favorite chef and wielding a wooden spoon like a weapon. She pulled both of us into a hug that smelled like cinnamon and wine, which meant she'd already been taste testing her cooking for quality control purposes. I'm so glad you're here. The turkey is taking forever. Your father has already had 3 glasses of whiskey, even though I told him to pace himself. And your sister's boys just knocked over a lamp, but it didn't break, so we're calling it a Christmas miracle. This was exactly the kind of controlled chaos I'd grown up with, and normally it would have made me smile with genuine warmth. But today, knowing what was coming, it felt more like the calm before a Category 5 hurricane. I was about to turn this Norman Rockwell painting into a Jackson Pollock splatter piece, and part of me felt guilty about it, but only a very small part. The rest of me was ready to watch this whole thing burn in the most spectacular way possible. My dad was in the living room, planted in his recliner like he'd been surgically attached to it, watching football with the volume way too loud because he refused to admit his hearing wasn't what it used to be. He raised his glass of whiskey in greeting when he saw me, already looking happy and buzzed in that way that suggested he'd started drinking around 10 in the morning. Derek, come test this whiskey with me. Your mother says I'm drinking too much, but I say it's Christmas and Jesus would want me to be happy. I'm 99% sure that's not how theology works, but I wasn't about to argue with my dad's Christmas logic. I poured myself a drink. I was definitely going to need it, and sat down with him for a few minutes, watching grown men chase a ball around a field while commentators talked about it like it was a matter of national security. My sister Jade appeared shortly after, looking exhausted in that special way that only parents of young children can achieve. Her hair was in a messy ponytail. She had what looked like jelly stains on her shirt, and her eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that suggested she'd been up since 5 in the morning dealing with twins hopped up on Christmas excitement and sugar. Derek, thank God you're here. Please tell me you brought alcohol stronger than wine, because I'm going to need it to survive today. If only she knew that the alcohol wasn't for surviving the twins. It was going to be for surviving the dinner theater production I was about to stage in approximately 2 hours. But I just smiled and told her there was plenty of whiskey, and she should definitely help herself. Lydia was in the kitchen with my mom, doing that thing where women bond over cooking and gossip. I could hear them laughing about something, probably some story my mom was telling about my dad's latest DIY project that had gone horribly wrong. Lydia looked completely at ease, comfortable, like she belonged here. Like she wasn't about to get exposed as a lying, manipulative person who'd invited her ex-boyfriend to her husband's family dinner while carrying on an emotional affair behind everyone's backs. The next hour passed in a blur of typical Christmas activities. The twins opened some presents early because they couldn't wait, and my sister had given up on discipline hours ago. My dad alternated between watching football and supervising the turkey, which really just meant opening the oven every 10 minutes to stare at it and declare it not ready yet. My mom stressed about side dishes and whether she'd made enough food, even though she'd made enough to feed a small army, and we all knew there would be leftovers for weeks. And me? I was checking my phone every 5 minutes, waiting for Clara's text confirming she was on her way. I told her to arrive around 2:45, which would give Adrian just enough time to get comfortable and let his guard down before the hammer dropped. The plan was simple but effective. Let Adrian arrive. Let everyone meet him and welcome him. Let Lydia feel good about her charitable decision. And then, boom, Clara walks in and the whole house of cards collapses. At 2:15, right on schedule, the doorbell rang. My mom literally squealed with excitement, which was slightly disturbing but also very on-brand for her. That must be Adrian. Oh, I'm so excited to meet him. Lydia's told me so much about what a nice young man he is. I watched Lydia's face light up like someone had plugged her into an electrical socket. She practically ran to the door, smoothing down her dress and checking her hair in the hallway mirror before opening it. And there he was, Adrian Kershaw, in the flesh, looking exactly like the kind of guy who would pull this kind of nonsense. He was tall, I'll give him that, with dark hair styled in that. I woke up like this, but actually spent 20 minutes on it, way that guys do when they're trying too hard. He was wearing a navy blue sweater that probably cost more than my car payment, and holding a bottle of wine that definitely cost more than my car payment. He had that confident, charming smile that probably worked on most people, the kind of smile that said, "I'm a good guy, you can trust me," while simultaneously being completely untrustworthy. "Adrian, come in, come in." Lydia pulled him into a hug that lasted approximately 4 seconds too long to be appropriate for someone who was just a friend. I watched from my position in the living room, drink in hand, smile plastered on my face, looking like the world's most understanding husband while internally, I was counting down the minutes until this whole charade exploded. Adrian came in, bringing with him a wave of expensive cologne that probably had a name like deception or betrayal or something equally ironic. He handed the wine to my mom, who accepted it like he'd just gifted her the Holy Grail. And then he made his rounds shaking hands and introducing himself to everyone. He had this whole routine down. Firm handshake, eye contact, self-deprecating humor about how he hoped he wasn't intruding on family time. It was a performance, and honestly, it was pretty good. I could see why Lydia had fallen for this guy originally, and why she was apparently still hung up on him. When he got to me, he extended his hand with that same confident smile. "Derek, right? Man, I really appreciate you being cool with me crashing your family Christmas. Lydia told me you're a really understanding guy." I shook his hand, probably gripping it a little harder than necessary, and smiled right back at him. "Of course, Adrian. Any friend of Lydia's is welcome here. I'm all about being mature and understanding." I put just enough emphasis on the word mature that only I would catch it, a little inside joke with myself about what was coming. My dad got Adrian a drink. My mom went back to fussing over the turkey, and everyone settled into that pre-dinner mingling phase where people stand around making small talk and pretending they're not just waiting to eat. Adrian and Lydia gravitated toward each other naturally, standing just a little too close, laughing just a little too loud at each other's jokes. My sister noticed it too. I caught her giving me a questioning look from across the room, like, is this weird, or is it just me? I gave her a subtle nod that said, "Oh, it's definitely weird, just wait." Adrian was working the room like a politician at a fundraiser, charming my mom with compliments about her decorating, bonding with my dad over some sports team they both apparently followed, even getting down on the floor to play with my sister's twins for a minute to show what a great guy he was. And through it all, Lydia was watching him with this look in her eyes that made my stomach turn. It was admiration mixed with nostalgia, mixed with something that definitely wasn't appropriate for a married woman looking at her ex-boyfriend. 2:30 came and went. 2:40 arrived. I checked my phone again. Clara had texted 15 minutes ago saying she was 10 minutes away and asking if I was sure about this. I'd responded with absolutely sure. See you soon. Now it was just a waiting game, watching the clock tick down to the moment when Christmas dinner turned into Christmas drama. At 2:43, my mom announced that dinner would be ready in about 15 minutes and everyone should start thinking about sitting down. People began migrating toward the dining room, where my mom had set up the table like we were hosting a presidential banquet. There were place cards, fancy napkins folded into shapes I couldn't identify, enough silverware to confuse an etiquette expert, and a centerpiece that probably violated some fire codes with the number of candles involved. Adrian and Lydia were laughing about something together near the window, completely in their own little world, when I heard it, the sound I'd been waiting for. The doorbell. That simple ding-dong that was about to change everything. The room got quiet for a second, everyone looking around in confusion because we weren't expecting anyone else. My mom glanced at my dad, who shrugged. My sister looked at me with raised eyebrows. Lydia and Adrian's laughter died off, both of them looking toward the door with mild curiosity. I'll get it, I said, setting down my drink and standing up with the kind of calm purpose that suggested I knew exactly who was on the other side of that door. Because I did. I absolutely did. I walked to the front door, very aware that everyone was watching me, probably wondering who could possibly be arriving this late to Christmas dinner. I took a deep breath, put my hand on the doorknob, and opened it with a smile that was probably a little too eager given the circumstances. There she was, Clara Mills. Red sweater, nervous smile, clutching a bottle of wine like it was emotional support, looking both terrified and determined in equal measure. Standing there in the doorway, looking at Clara's face, I had this weird moment of clarity where I realized there was no going back from this. Once she stepped through that door, once she entered my parents' house and everyone saw her, the dominoes would start falling and there would be no way to stop them. This was the point of no return, the moment where I either committed to blowing up my marriage in front of my entire family on Christmas Day, or I chickened out and sent Clara away and lived the rest of my life as the guy who let his wife walk all over him. And honestly, there was no universe where I was choosing option 2. Clara, I said, loud enough that people inside could hear me, my voice warm and welcoming like she was an old friend I'd been expecting all along. I'm so glad you could make it. Come on in. She stepped inside, and I could feel the shift in the room's energy immediately. It was like someone had pressed pause on a movie. Everyone just froze, mid-conversation, mid-movement, mid-everything. My mom was halfway to the kitchen with an empty serving dish. My dad had his whiskey glass raised to his lips, but hadn't taken the sip yet. My sister was bent down talking to one of the twins, but her head snapped up so fast I'm surprised she didn't get whiplash. And Lydia. Oh, Lydia's face was absolutely priceless. She went from happy and glowing to confused to horrified in about 2 seconds flat, like watching someone's soul leave their body in real time. But the real show was Adrian. This man, this smooth-talking, confident, charming man who'd been working the room like he owned the place, suddenly looked like he'd seen a ghost. Actually, worse than a ghost. He looked like he'd seen his fiancée at his ex-girlfriend's husband's family Christmas dinner, which is exactly what was happening because that's exactly what she was. All the color drained from his face so fast I was genuinely concerned he might pass out right there on my parents' Persian rug that my mom was weirdly protective of. Clara. Adrian's voice came out strangled, like someone was squeezing his throat. He actually took a step backward, bumping into the side table and nearly knocking over one of my mom's decorative candles. What are you doing here? Clara, to her absolute credit, didn't falter. She stood there in her red sweater, holding that wine bottle, and smiled in a way that was equal parts sweet and terrifying. It was the smile of someone who had reached their limit and was now operating on pure adrenaline and righteous anger. I was invited, she said, her voice steady and clear. Then she turned to me, her eyes showing just a flicker of appreciation. By your ex-girlfriend's husband. Derek invited me. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a snowflake land outside. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I'm pretty sure time itself stopped for a solid 5 seconds while everyone's brains tried to process what was happening. My sister's mouth was literally hanging open. My dad had finally lowered his whiskey glass and was staring at the scene unfolding in front of him like it was the most entertaining thing he'd seen all year, which it probably was. My mom looked completely confused, her eyes darting between me, Clara, Adrian, and Lydia like she was watching a tennis match played by 4 people simultaneously. I took Clara's wine bottle and her coat, playing the perfect host, smiling like this was all completely normal and planned. Everyone, this is Clara Mills. Clara, this is my family. My mom Susan, my dad Frank, my sister Jade, and her twins Tyler and Mason. And I believe you already know Adrian here. Know him? Clara's voice had an edge to it now, that polite veneer starting to crack just a little. I'm engaged to him. Or at least, I was until about 3 days ago when I found out he's been lying to me about where he'd be spending Christmas. You could have heard a pin drop in that moment. Actually, you could have heard a pin thinking about dropping. The silence was so thick and heavy it was almost a physical presence in the room. My mom made this little gasping sound, her hand flying to her chest like she was clutching pearls she wasn't actually wearing. My sister whispered, "Oh my God," under her breath, but in the silence it sounded like she'd screamed it through a megaphone. Adrian finally found his voice, though it came out about 3 octaves higher than normal. Clara, this isn't what it looks like. I can explain. This is just a misunderstanding. Really. Clara took a step further into the room, and I gotta say, watching her transform from nervous to confrontational was like watching a superhero origin story in real time. You told me you were going to a work party. A mandatory work party at your Jewish boss's house, remember? You were very specific about the details, Adrian. So either you lied to me about this dinner, or you lied to these people about having a work party. Which is it? Lydia finally unfroze, her face cycling through about 17 different emotions before settling on defensive anger. She turned to me, her eyes blazing, her voice shaking with a mixture of fury and humiliation. Derek, what the hell is this? How could you invite her here? To your parents' house? On Christmas? I set Clara's wine bottle down on the entry table with exaggerated care, then turned to my wife with the calmest, most reasonable expression I could manage. Inside, I was doing cartwheels. Outside, I was the picture of mature rationality. I was just being mature about the situation, sweetheart. You know, like you asked me to be. When you invited your ex-boyfriend to my family's Christmas dinner without really discussing it with me first, I figured if we're welcoming old flames to family gatherings, we might as well make it fair and invite Adrian's current flame too. Equal opportunity holiday inclusion and all that. My dad made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh, quickly covering it by taking a long drink of his whiskey. My sister wasn't even trying to hide her reaction anymore. She had pulled out her phone and was definitely recording this, her eyes sparkling with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing truly spectacular drama that doesn't directly involve you. This is completely different. Lydia's voice was getting higher, more desperate. She looked around the room like she was searching for allies, but everyone was just staring at her with various expressions of shock, confusion, and, in my dad's case, barely concealed amusement. Adrian was going through a hard time. I was trying to be charitable. Charitable. Clara laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was the laugh of someone who'd been pushed too far and was now done with everyone's nonsense. Is that what we're calling emotional affairs now? Charity work? Because I've seen the messages, Lydia. Derek sent me screenshots. All those "I miss you" and "what if we tried harder" texts. That's not charity. That's something else entirely. Adrian tried to approach Clara, his hands up in a placating gesture like he was trying to calm down a wild animal. Clara, baby, please. Those messages were taken out of context. Lydia and I are just old friends catching up. There's nothing going on between us. Then why did you lie to me about coming here? Clara shot back, not backing down an inch. If this was just innocent friend stuff, why make up an elaborate story about a work party? Why not just tell me the truth, that you were having Christmas dinner with your ex-girlfriend and her husband's family? Because I knew you'd overreact. Adrian's frustration was showing now, his careful charm cracking under pressure. I knew you'd make it into something it wasn't. Oh, I'm overreacting? Clara's voice went up a notch. You've been texting your ex about missing her and wondering about what could have been. You lied to me about your whereabouts on Christmas, and somehow I'm the one who's overreacting? That's rich, Adrian. That's really rich. My mom, who had been standing frozen in shock this entire time, finally found her voice. It came out small and confused, like a child trying to understand a complicated math problem. I don't understand what's happening. Susan, can someone explain what's happening? My sister, bless her chaotic heart, stepped in to help. Mom, apparently Lydia invited her ex-boyfriend to Christmas dinner, told Derek to be mature about it, but forgot to mention that said ex-boyfriend is engaged to someone else and has been having an emotional affair with Lydia. And Derek, being the absolute legend that he is, invited the fiancé to dinner too. So now we're all here together. It's like a Hallmark movie, but way more entertaining. Jade, my mom looked scandalized, though I noticed she didn't actually disagree with the assessment. Lydia turned her fury on me again, tears starting to form in her eyes now. You went through my phone. You invaded my privacy. That's illegal. Actually, it's not, I said calmly, because I'd looked this up during one of my many sleepless nights this week. We're married. Legally, there's no expectation of privacy between spouses regarding shared devices and accounts. But nice try with the deflection. Very mature of you. There was that word again. Mature. It was becoming my favorite weapon in this whole mess. Adrian and Lydia started talking over each other, both of them trying to explain and justify and rationalize what had been happening. Adrian insisted it was just friendship, that Clara was overreacting, that the messages didn't mean anything serious. Lydia claimed she was just being kind to someone going through a difficult time, that I was making it into something it wasn't, that I'd betrayed her trust by going through her phone. Their stories didn't match. Adrian's version contradicted Lydia's, and neither of them seemed to notice or care. They were too busy trying to save themselves to realize they were sinking each other's lifeboats. It was glorious. Absolutely, spectacularly glorious. This was better than any movie, any TV show, any piece of entertainment I'd ever witnessed. This was real-life karma playing out in real time, and I had orchestrated the whole thing. Clara watched them spiral with this expression of disgusted fascination, like she was watching a car crash in slow motion and couldn't look away. Finally, she'd had enough. She held up her hand, silencing both of them mid-excuse. You know what? I don't actually care about your explanations anymore. I don't care about the justifications or the excuses or whatever mental gymnastics you're both doing to make yourselves feel better about this. What I care about is that you're both liars. You lied to me, Adrian. You lied to Derek, Lydia. You lied to yourselves if you think this was ever going to end well. She took off her engagement ring, this beautiful, expensive-looking thing that probably cost more than my car, and held it up in the light for a second. Then she walked over to where Adrian was standing, dropped the ring into his hand like it was a piece of trash, and said with perfect, cold clarity, "We're done. Lose my number. Lose my address. Lose any memory you have of me, because I'm sure as hell going to forget you ever existed." Then she turned on her heel and walked straight toward the front door. But before she left, she stopped next to me, put her hand on my shoulder, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Thanks for inviting me, Derek. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. Merry Christmas." And with that, Clara Mills walked out of my parents' house and out of Adrian's life, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the entire world had stopped spinning. The silence after Clara left lasted for maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like 10 years. Everyone just stood there, frozen like we were all extras in a movie who'd forgotten our lines and were waiting for the director to yell "cut" so we could reset and try again. Except there was no director, no reset button, and this train wreck was still very much in motion. Adrian was standing there holding his engagement ring like it was a live grenade, his face a fascinating shade of pale green that suggested he might actually throw up on my parents' hardwood floors. And Lydia looked like her entire world had just collapsed, which, to be fair, it kind of had. Then Adrian broke the silence by doing exactly what cowards do when they're caught. He tried damage control. "Clara, wait." He lunged toward the door, nearly tripping over one of my nephew's toy trucks that had been left on the floor. "Clara, this isn't what it looks like. Please, just let me explain." But Clara was already gone, her car, door slamming outside with a finality that echoed through the whole house. I heard her engine start, heard the tires squeal slightly as she peeled out of the driveway, and I smiled. Good for her. That woman deserved so much better than Adrian Kershaw and his carefully constructed web of lies. Adrian stood at the door for a second, staring out at where Clara's car had been, looking utterly defeated. Then he spun around and fixed his eyes on me with the kind of anger that comes from someone realizing they've been outplayed. What the hell, man? Why would you do that? Why would you invite her here? I leaned against the wall, crossed my arms, and gave him my best. Are you seriously asking me that question? Look. Why would I invite your fiancé to a family dinner? Gee, Adrian, I don't know. Maybe because you're engaged and planning a wedding, but spending your free time texting my wife about how much you miss her? Maybe because you lied to Clara about where you'd be tonight? Or maybe, and here's a wild thought, maybe because you're a lying, manipulative dirtbag who deserved to get called out in the most public way possible. You had no right. Adrian was getting loud now, his voice echoing off my parents' walls in a way that made my mom visibly wince. That was between me and Clara. You didn't need to get involved. Oh, but it was totally fine for you to get involved in my marriage. I pushed off the wall, taking a step toward him. It was cool for you to text my wife at all hours, reminisce about your relationship, talk about what could have been. That was fine, but me inviting your fiancé to meet you is crossing a line? The audacity is honestly impressive, man. My dad, who'd been watching this whole thing unfold with the fascination of someone watching a nature documentary, finally spoke up. Son's got a point there, Adrian. You can't really play the victim card when you were actively participating in whatever the hell this situation is. Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Lydia finally found her voice. She turned on me with a fury I'd rarely seen from her, her face red, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. Derek, how could you do this? How could you humiliate me like this? In front of your entire family? On Christmas? And there it was. Not, I'm sorry for what I did. Not, I'm sorry for lying to you. Not, I'm sorry for emotionally cheating with my ex-boyfriend. No, it was, how could you humiliate me? Like she was the victim in this scenario. Like I was the bad guy for pulling back the curtain on her deception. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I felt something inside me just snap. Not in an angry way, but in a final, decisive way. Like a cord being cut. I humiliated you? My voice was calm, almost eerily calm, which somehow made it more effective than if I'd been yelling. I humiliated you by exposing the truth? Lydia, you humiliated yourself. You invited your ex-boyfriend to my parents' house for Christmas dinner. You went behind my back to get my mom's approval. You've been having an emotional affair with a man who's engaged to someone else. You did all of that. I just provided the lighting and the audience. It wasn't an affair. Lydia was crying harder now, her voice breaking. We were just talking. He's my friend. I was trying to help him through a difficult time. What difficult time? I spread my arms wide, gesturing at Adrian, who was still standing by the door, looking like he wanted to melt into the floor. The difficult time of planning a wedding to a woman he was lying to? The difficult time of juggling an emotional affair with you while maintaining his relationship with Clara? Those difficult times. Adrian jumped in, probably sensing that Lydia was drowning and trying to throw her a life preserver even though they were both already underwater. Look, Derek, Lydia's right. It wasn't like that. We were just friends catching up. The messages were taken out of context. Out of context. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the screenshots I'd saved, and started reading out loud. Adrian, I miss what we had. Things were so simple back then, you know? We just got each other. Lydia, I know. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we tried harder. If we'd been more mature back then. I looked up from my phone. What context makes that appropriate for a married woman to say to her ex-boyfriend? Please, enlighten me. I'm dying to know. My sister, who'd been quietly recording this entire exchange on her phone like she was documenting history, let out a low whistle. Damn, Derek. You came prepared. This is better than anything on Netflix. Jade, not now, my mom hissed, but I noticed she didn't actually tell her to stop recording. Lydia was fully sobbing at this point, those big, heaving sobs that made her whole body shake. You went through my phone. You invaded my privacy. That's a violation of trust. Oh, we're talking about violations of trust now. I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out bitter. That's rich, Lydia. That's really rich. You know what's a violation of trust? Inviting your ex to Christmas dinner without really discussing it with your husband. Having inappropriate conversations with said ex while you're married. Going behind my back to my own mother to get approval for something you knew I wouldn't be okay with. Those are violations of trust. Me checking your phone after you dropped a bomb on our marriage? That's called gathering evidence. Adrian tried a different approach, switching from anger to pleading. Look, man, I'm sorry. You're right. The messages were inappropriate. I shouldn't have said those things. But nothing physical happened between us. It was just talk. We never crossed that line. Oh, well, that makes it all better, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You only emotionally cheated. You only lied to your fiancé. You only helped destroy my marriage with words instead of actions. Totally fine then. My bad for overreacting. Derek, please. Lydia reached for my arm, but I stepped back. Please, can we just talk about this privately? Not here. Not in front of everyone. I shook my head. You made this public when you invited Adrian to my family's Christmas dinner. You made this everyone's business. You don't get to control the narrative now that it's blown up in your face. My dad cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. He'd been relatively quiet during this whole exchange, just sipping his whiskey and watching like he was front row at the world's most uncomfortable theater production. I think, he said slowly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from being a father and having zero patience for nonsense, that what we have here is a failure of basic respect and honesty. Lydia, you're my daughter-in-law, and I've always liked you. But what you did here was wrong. Dead wrong. You don't invite an ex to your husband's family gathering without a real conversation about it first. And you definitely don't do it while carrying on inappropriate conversations with said ex. He turned to Adrian. And you, son, need to get your priorities straight. You were engaged to a woman who seemed lovely from the 30 seconds I saw her, and you threw that away to play footsie with your ex-girlfriend who's married to someone else. That's not just stupid, that's disrespectful to everyone involved. Coming from my dad, who usually avoided family drama like it was contagious, this was basically the equivalent of a presidential address. Even Adrian and Lydia seemed momentarily stunned into silence. My mom, ever the one to try to salvage situations, wrung her hands nervously. Maybe we should all just sit down and have dinner? Talk about this calmly over turkey. Susan, I love you, but read the room, my dad said gently. Nobody's in the mood for turkey right now. I turned to Lydia, and I felt this strange sense of calm wash over me. The anger was gone. The hurt was still there, but it was manageable now. What I felt most strongly was clarity. Lydia, I want you to leave. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. What? I want you to leave. Go stay with your sister. Go stay in a hotel. I don't really care. But I don't want you in our house tonight. Or any night, actually. We're done. Derek, no. Please don't do this. She was pleading now, reaching for me again. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. We can fix this. I took another step back, maintaining distance between us. There's nothing to fix, Lydia. You made your choices. You chose to prioritize Adrian's feelings over mine. You chose to lie to me. You chose to have inappropriate conversations with your ex while wearing my wedding ring. Those were all your choices, and now I'm making mine. We're done. You're overreacting, she said, her voice taking on a desperate edge. You're being dramatic. It's just because you're hurt right now. Give it a few days, and you'll see that this isn't worth throwing away our whole marriage. My sister made a scoffing sound. Girl, he's not overreacting. If my husband pulled this, I'd have thrown his stuff out the window by now. Jade, helpful, I said, though I appreciated the support. I looked back at Lydia. I'm not being dramatic. I'm being rational. You betrayed my trust in multiple ways. You showed me who you really are, and I'm choosing to believe you and act accordingly. My mom stepped forward, looking torn between wanting to comfort everyone and wanting to take sides. Derek, honey, are you sure about this? It's Christmas. Maybe everyone just needs to cool down and talk about this tomorrow when emotions aren't so high. Mom, I love you, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I kept my eyes on Lydia. You can stay with your sister until we figure out the divorce paperwork. I'll have my lawyer contact you next week. The word divorce hung in the air like a bomb, and Lydia actually gasped like I'd physically hit her. You can't be serious. Derek, please. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll stop talking to Adrian. I'll do whatever you want. Just please don't leave me. But here's the thing. I'd heard enough apologies that weren't really apologies. I'd seen enough tears that were more about getting caught than being genuinely sorry. And I was done. Completely, utterly done. Lydia, leave. Now. Before I say things I'll regret, and that my mother definitely doesn't want to hear. My voice was steel, and I think she finally realized I wasn't budging. She looked around the room one more time, maybe hoping someone would come to her defense, but everyone was either looking away or looking at her with varying degrees of disappointment. Even my mom, who usually tried to see the best in everyone, couldn't quite meet her eyes. Finally, Lydia grabbed her purse and coat with shaking hands, shot me one last look that was equal parts devastation and fury, and stormed out. Adrian followed her like a lost puppy, mumbling something about giving her a ride because she was too upset to drive safely. The door slammed behind them with enough force to rattle the windows, and suddenly it was just me, my family, and the most awkward silence in Christmas history. My mom was the first to speak, her voice soft and worried. "Derek, sweetheart, are you okay?" I surprised myself by actually meaning it when I said, "Yeah, Mom, I really am." My dad walked over and put his hand on my shoulder, giving it a squeeze. "Son, that took guts. I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself." My sister was still holding her phone, a huge grin on her face. "Dude, that was legendary. Seriously, that was the most epic thing I've ever witnessed." I ended up staying at my parents' house that night, sleeping in my old childhood bedroom with the same posters on the walls from high school. It was weirdly comforting, like going back to a simpler time before marriages and betrayals and dramatic Christmas dinners. My phone was blowing up with texts from Lydia, 17 messages ranging from, "You're being cruel and unreasonable," to "Please, let's just talk about this like adults," to "I never meant to hurt you." I replied exactly once, "Talk to my lawyer." Then I muted her number and finally got some actual sleep for the first time in weeks. My sister had already uploaded the dinner footage to our extended family group chat, and by morning my phone had about 40 notifications from cousins, aunts, uncles, and even my grandmother asking what the hell happened and if I was okay. 2 months later, the divorce papers were signed and finalized. Lydia didn't contest anything, probably too embarrassed to drag this out in court where more people would hear about what she'd done. I moved back into our house after she cleared out her stuff, and honestly, it felt lighter somehow, like a weight I didn't know I'd been carrying had finally lifted. Clara and I met for coffee a few weeks after Christmas, not for romance, but for closure. We laughed about how absolutely insane that dinner had been, how we'd both dodged bullets shaped like lying significant others. She thanked me for exposing the truth before she'd married Adrian, and I thanked her for having the courage to show up and blow everything wide open. Lydia sent me an email eventually, saying she never meant to hurt me and hoped we could be friends someday. I archived it under a folder I labeled Seasonal Comedy and never looked at it again.